Close your eyes and let the heavy velvet of the night wrap around you, shutting out the flickering lights of the modern world until there is only the vast, quiet theatre of the mind. Imagine for a moment that you are standing not on a floor of wood or carpet, but on the shifting warm sands of the Levant, where the air smells of dried thyme, ancient dust, and the cooling heat of a sun that has just dipped below the horizon, leaving the sky painted in bruised purples and deep indigos. Here, the wind whispers secrets across the dunes, carrying the echoes of empires that have risen and crumbled like sand castles in the tide. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know your city and local time in the comments so we can see where everyone is listening from. End of part 1. Now breathe in that ancient air and let us drift back to a time when the world held its breath. The history of the medieval world, already a tangled, painful chapter, was violently rewritten by the arrival of a nomadic force so terrifying that it was often described not as an army, but as a force of nature, a storm that had no centre and no end. The great Mongol Invasions swept out of Asia in the 13th century, fundamentally reshaping the map of Asia and the Middle East, turning old certainties into dust. They were the invincible horde that had burned Baghdad and piled the skulls of its scholars into pyramids, threatening to bring the entire Islamic civilization to annihilation. But before the Mongols themselves arrived in the Holy Land, their shadow fell long and dark across the earth. The initial impact of this relentless westward movement was felt indirectly in the Levant, setting the stage for greater conflict, much like the tremors that precede a volcanic eruption. As the Mongol Khan advanced, he pushed entire nations before them like debris before a tsunami. Among these displaced nations were the Khwarezmian Turks, desperate warriors fleeing the Mongol advance, men who had lost their homes and had nothing left to lose but their lives. This desperate, surging wave of refugees and broken tribes poured into the already complex environment of the Holy Land, upsetting the delicate balance of power like a bull in a china shop, or perhaps more accurately, like a wolf pack in a sheep pen. In 1244, these Khwarezmian Turks struck a devastating blow, sacking Jerusalem with a ferocity that eclipsed 1099. They burned the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and butchered the priests at the altars. The sacking of the Holy City by these displaced warriors was catastrophic. Jerusalem was lost again to the Christians and would remain so for nearly 7 centuries, a loss that felt like a phantom limb to the kingdoms of Europe. The loss of Jerusalem triggered a final desperate spasm of unity. The remaining Crusader barons, recognizing the sheer danger of this chaotic new foe, patched up their quarrels and joined forces with the Ayyubid emir of Damascus, who was equally terrified of the Khwarezmians and their Egyptian allies. It is a rare moment in history when enemies look at each other, shrug, and decide that the enemy of my enemy is my friend. At least until Tuesday. This strange twilight alliance, Templars and Hospitallers riding side by side with Muslim cavalry against a common foe, ended in tragedy. At the Battle of La Forby in 1244, the coalition was annihilated and the military power of the Latin kingdom was broken forever. The Mongols had not yet directly arrived, but their immense pressure had already ensured the fragmentation and near demise of the established powers in the Levant. The ultimate showdown, the moment the world held its breath, however, arrived in 1260. The Mongols, having continued their devastating advance, rode into Syria. The threat was so severe that a new Muslim power, the Mamluks of Egypt, who had been building professional armies and strong states, realized they could not focus on the viral infection of the Crusader presence. Instead, they had to save the world. The confrontation was forced upon the newly dominant Mamluk Sultanate, a professional military machine born from slave soldiers, Mamluks meaning owned or property, though they owned the battlefield. Led by the great warrior Baibars, a man with one eye and a gaze that could seemingly strip paint from a wall, the Mamluks looked north to face the seemingly invincible horde. In this moment of world historical tension, the remaining Franks of Acre, recognising the danger the Mongols posed to all civilizations, committed an act of suicidal neutrality. They allowed the Mamluk army, their sworn enemy, to pass through their territory to meet the Mongol threat. This decision, born of complex calculation and perhaps a bit of existential dread, saved the Middle East but doomed the Crusader states. The culmination came on September 3rd, 1260, at the Battle of Ain Jalut, the Spring of Goliath. The Mamluks met the Mongol army in a direct confrontation that was described as one of the most decisive battles in human history. Sultan Baibars, commanding the vanguard, employed tactical genius, successfully luring the Mongols into a trap in the valley. The battle that followed broke the myth of Mongol invincibility. The Mamluks had achieved what no army from China to Poland had managed. The invincible horde was broken. The victory at Ain Jalut was not only a defining moment for Islamic civilization, but also a death sentence for the Latin East. The Mongols, though beaten, had effectively served as a geopolitical catalyst. They had destroyed the fragmented Ayyubid power structure and forced a unified, militarized response from the Mamluks. Baibars returned to Egypt as a hero, but immediately consolidated his brutal reign, assassinating his own predecessor to seize the throne, because in the high-stakes game of medieval thrones, retirement plans were rarely peaceful. With the threat of the Mongols contained, Baibars later drove them back across the Euphrates. The Mamluk Sultan turned his full attention toward the coast. The Crusader states were now left exposed, relying on their massive castles and the hope of relief from Europe that never came. The Mamluks, having defeated the world's greatest conquerors, looked at the Franks not as chivalrous peers, but as a viral infection to be burned out. Baibars and his successors systematically began to dismantle the Crusader strongholds, destroying walls, filling harbours, and smashing piers, literally reshaping the geography of the Holy Land to make it inhospitable to the west. Thus the vast shadow cast by the Mongol invasions, a force of chaos that threatened total destruction, ironically led to the creation of the disciplined military superpower that ultimately finished the Crusades. By 1291, the Mamluks had driven the Mongols back across the Euphrates and the Franks into the sea, ending the 200-year era of Latin Christian presence in the Holy Land. But this ending, this swirling dust settling over the ruins of Acre, is merely the final ripple of a stone cast into the pond of history decades earlier, thousands of miles away. To truly understand the fire that forged this world, we must leave the heat of the Syrian desert. We must let the camera of our mind pull back, rising high above the Mediterranean, drifting eastward over the peaks of the Zagros Mountains, over the smoking ruins of Baghdad, which hasn't yet fallen in our timeline, across the vast flat expanse of the Central Asian steppe. The air here changes. It grows colder, thinner, sharper. The smell of thyme and olive oil is replaced by the scent of pine, crushed snow, and the musk of wet wool. We are travelling back in time, away from the complex politics of 1260, and into the raw, brutal silence of the late 12th century. Below us lies a land of infinite horizon, the eternal blue sky, where the grass stretches like a green ocean to the edge of the world. It is a land where survival is not a given, but a daily negotiation with the wind and the cold. Historians still debate the precise environmental factors that triggered the Great Expansion, whether it was a drop in temperature shortening the growing season or a sudden abundance of rain that swelled the grasslands, but one thing is certain, the steppes were a crucible. Here, amidst the gyre tents and the herds of hardy ponies, the world is quiet. There are no great stone cities yet, no libraries burning, no Mamluk armies. There is only the wind, and in this vast silence there is a boy. He is not yet a Khan. He is not yet a conqueror. He is merely a child named Temujin, shivering in the outcast fringes of his society, clutching a knucklebone in his hand, unaware that the fire burning in his belly will one day consume the world. The force of nature, that would one day pile skulls like pyramids, begins here, not with a roar, but with the soft crunch of footsteps in the snow, and a family trying to survive the long, dark winter. The wind that howls across the Mongolian steppe is not merely air moving from high pressure to low. It is a living thing, a storyteller that remembers every blade of grass it has flattened and every fire it has stoked. It carries the scent of wild onions and damp earth, blowing from the boy shivering in the snow to the man standing tall on the banks of the Onon River. The years have passed like shadows over the grass, turning the outcast child Temujin into a survivor, a warrior, and finally a magnet for every lost soul on the plateau. It is the spring of 1286, the year of the tiger, and the world is about to change, though the birds singing in the high reeds give no warning. If you listen closely underneath the wind, you can hear a low, rhythmic thrumming, not thunder, but the heartbeat of a new nation. Thousands of horses are stamping the earth, their breath misting in the cool morning air. Tents, or jers, made of white felt stretch out for miles, looking like a scattering of pearls dropped by a careless giant onto the green velvet of the valley. This is the Great Kurultai, a massive assembly of the tribes, a political Woodstock, with significantly more fermented mare's milk and sharper weaponry. The tribes of the steppe, the Karaits, the Naimans, the Merkits, the Tatars, have spent centuries tearing each other apart in a cycle of vendetta and theft, stealing horses and wives in a tangled, painful chapter of unending civil war. But today, the fighting has stopped. Today, they look toward one man. Temujin stands at the centre of this swirling humanity. He is no longer the frightened boy clutching a knucklebone. He is a presence, a gravity well. He is tall, with cat-like eyes that some chroniclers claim were green or grey, and a beard that frames a face weathered by 50 years of windburn and warfare. He has done the impossible. He has not just defeated his enemies, he has absorbed them. In a move of brilliant, terrifying pragmatism, Temujin has discarded the old aristocratic lineages that governed steppe life. He realised early on that nepotism is a terrible way to run an army. Your cousin might be fun at a feast, but that doesn't mean he knows how to lead a cavalry charge. Instead, he has built a meritocracy. If a man is loyal and skilled, he rises. If he is noble but incompetent, he is usually relegated to guarding the sheep, or worse. This is the first great historical truth of the Mongols. Their empire was built not just on blood, but on a radical reorganisation of society that valued competence above pedigree. He broke the tribes apart and reshuffled them into the Arban, 10, the Zun, 100, the Mingan, 1,000, and the Tumen, 10,000. Men who once swore allegiance to a clan now swear allegiance to their unit, and to the Khan alone. It is a military machine built of flesh and bone, perfectly responsive, where an order whispered at the top ripples down to the humblest soldier with the speed of a snapping whip. At the height of the gathering, a shaman climbs the sacred mount. The sky is a piercing, impossible blue. The eternal blue sky, Tengri, the supreme deity of the Mongols. The shaman proclaims that it is the will of heaven that Temujin rule all people who live in felt tents. A white standard is raised, the 9-tailed white banner. It is made from the tails of 9 white horses flowing in the wind like spirits. This banner is more than a flag. It is the repository of the nation's soul, the home of the protector spirits. When the wind catches the horsehair, the Mongols believe the spirits are present, watching, waiting. Under this banner, Temujin receives a new title, a name that will echo until the end of time, Genghis Khan, or as the West will come to know him, Genghis Khan. Historians still argue whether the title Genghis derives from the Turkic word for ocean, implying a rule as vast and boundless as the sea, or if it comes from a root meaning fierce or hard. Perhaps it is both. The ocean, after all, is beautiful until it swallows you whole. The proclamation settles over the crowd like a physical weight. He is now the universal ruler. The chaos of the steppe has been bottled, corked, and pressurized, but a ruler needs laws, or at least some ground rules to keep the newly unified tribes from reverting to their favourite pastime of stealing each other's livestock. Thus, Genghis promulgates the Yasa, the Great Law. It is a code that governs everything from military discipline to daily life. It forbids the washing of clothes in running water to avoid angering the water spirits, polluting the source, mandates hospitality to travellers, and creates a postal system that will eventually span the continent. It also includes some oddly specific rules, such as the death penalty for choking on food at a feast, though this might be a later exaggeration by terrified chroniclers, or perhaps Genghis just really hated bad table manners. In truth, the Yasa was likely never a single written document, but a collection of oral decrees and customs solidified by the Khan's will. It creates a piece of the steppe so rigid that it is said a virgin carrying a sack of gold could ride from one end of the empire to the other unharmed, mostly because anyone who harmed her would find themselves dismantled with surgical precision by the nearest patrol. The Mongol warrior, the atom of this new organism, is a figure of contrasts. He is short, bow-legged, from a lifetime in the saddle, clad in a silk undershirt which helps drive arrowheads out of wounds, and heavy leather armour. He rides a pony that looks like a bad joke, small, shaggy, with a head too large for its body. But this pony can march for days on a handful of grass and dig through snow to find fodder. They are the SUVs of the medieval world, ugly, rugged, and capable of going absolutely anywhere. As the Kurultai winds down, the feasting begins. Irag, fermented mare's milk with a sour alcoholic kick, flows freely. The air is filled with the drone of kume throat singing, a sound that mimics the wind and the water, vibrating deep in the chest. But amidst the celebration, Genghis Khan does not rest. He sits on a pile of furs, his eyes scanning the horizon. He knows that unity is fragile. A stationary army breeds discontent. Old grudges rise, like damp when the sun goes down. The force of nature he has created cannot sit still. It must move. It must feed. The unification of the steppe is not the end of the story. It is merely the opening credits. To the south lies the Jin dynasty of China, a golden empire of silk, rice, and towering walls, whose rulers have long treated the Mongols as troublesome barbarians, paying them pittances and stirring up tribal conflicts to keep them weak. To the west lie the sultanates of the Silk Road. The 9-tailed banner twitches in the breeze, pointing away from the heartland. The great Khan stands, and the shadow of the banner stretches long across the grass, reaching toward the edge of the known world. The machine is built. The engine is humming. Now, the Khan must decide where to drive it. The silence of the steppe is about to be broken by the thunder of 100,000 hooves, and the world beyond the horizon, sleeping comfortably in its stone castles and walled cities, has no idea that the wolf is no longer at the door. He has already torn the door down and is currently rearranging the furniture. The force of nature turns its gaze south toward the dragon. The gaze of the great Khan turned south, and the camera of our mind must follow, drifting away from the waving grasses of the steppe and over the harsh, pebbled expanse of the Gobi Desert, a barrier that had long kept the worlds of the nomad and the farmer apart. To the south lay the Jin dynasty of northern China, a civilization so ancient and so wealthy that to the Mongols it must have seemed like a different planet. The Jin were the golden kings, rulers of millions, masters of silk and iron, ensconced behind walls of rammed earth and stone that stretched like the spine of a sleeping dragon across the hills. They viewed the Mongols as a nuisance, a flea on the back of a tiger, useful perhaps as mercenaries, but certainly not a threat to the celestial order. When Genghis Khan sent an envoy to the Jin emperor demanding submission, the emperor reportedly spat towards the north and sneered, "Our empire is as vast as the sea, yours is but a handful of sand." See, it was a miscalculation of cosmic proportions, the kind of arrogance that history loves to punish with ironic brutality. The Jin relied on their static defences, specifically the early iterations of the Great Wall. Here we find a moment of myth versus reality. The Great Wall we picture today, the grey stone snake winding over mountains, is largely a creation of the much later Ming dynasty. In the 13th century, the walls were a complex network of earthen ramparts, moats, and garrisoned forts. They were formidable, yes, meant to stop raiding parties of a few hundred men, but they were never designed to hold back a force of nature that moved with the fluidity of water. In 1211, the Mongols crossed the desert, not as a disorganized rabble, but as a disciplined tide. They did not smash against the wall, they flowed around it, bribing gatekeepers or finding unguarded passes known only to the foxes and the wind. The Jin armies, vast and lumbering, marched out to meet them at the Battle of Yahuling, the Battle of Badgermouth. The terrain was rugged, a nightmare for cavalry, or so the Jin generals thought. But Genghis Khan, the master of the hunt, turned the mountains into a trap. He sent his heavy cavalry smashing into the Jin centre, while his light horsemen rained arrows from the ridges. The result was not a battle, but a dismantling. The Jin army, hundreds of thousands strong, disintegrated, their bodies filling the passes so deeply that chroniclers wrote the stench of decay lingered for years, a ghostly reminder to any traveller who dared pass that way. But winning a battle in the open field is one thing, taking a city is another. The Mongols were riders, hunters of the open plain. They had no concept of siege warfare. When they first approached the great fortified cities of the Jin, they were baffled by the stone monsters that swallowed their arrows and laughed at their swords. A nomad on a horse is a god on the steppe, but at the foot of a 40-foot wall, he is just a man looking up. This is where the genius of Genghis Khan shines brightest, his ability to adapt. He did not stubbornly throw his men against the walls. He learned. He captured Chinese engineers, men who knew the secrets of leverage and tension. He offered them a simple choice: work for the horde or join the pile of skulls. Unsurprisingly, the engineers found themselves suddenly very enthusiastic about Mongol employment. Soon, the Mongols were building traction trebuchets, massive catapults that could hurl stones the size of sheep, and giant crossbows that fired bolts like telephone poles. They learned to divert rivers to flood foundations and to dig tunnels to collapse towers. The barbarians became technicians of destruction. They also employed a ruthless psychological tactic known as the harrowing. As they advanced, they would drive the terrified peasantry from the countryside ahead of them, a surging human wave that fled toward the safety of the walled cities. The Jin commanders, bound by duty to protect their people, would open the gates. But this was the trap. The refugees flooded the cities, eating up the food supplies, spreading disease, and creating panic. The Mongols weaponized mercy, using the enemy's population to choke the enemy's strongholds. The culmination of this campaign was the siege of Zhongdu, the city that would one day become Beijing. It was a metropolis of unrivaled splendour, with palaces of gold and lacquer. But by 1214 it was a prison. The Mongols surrounded it, not attacking, but waiting. They built a wall around the city's wall, a strangling loop of timber and earth. Inside, the situation descended into a horror story. The food ran out. Then the leather armour was boiled and eaten. Then, the stories say, the people began to look at each other not as neighbours, but as meals. The dragon was starving in its lair. Historians still argue about the extent of the destruction that followed the surrender in 1215. Some accounts describe a total annihilation, a month-long bonfire where the smoke blotted out the sun and the grease of the burning city soaked into the earth. Others suggest the Mongols were more pragmatic, looting the wealth and skilled artisans while leaving the shell of the city. What is certain is that the fall of Zhongdu was a shock that vibrated across the known world. The invincible Jin had been broken. The Mongols stripped the city of its treasures. Carts laden with silk, silver and gold rolled north for weeks, a river of glitter flowing back to the felt tents of the steppe. But perhaps the most valuable prize was not the gold, but a man, Yelu Chukai, a tall, bearded Khitan scholar who had served the Jin. When brought before Genghis, the Khan teased him. The Jin were your enemies. I have avenged you. Yelu Chukai replied with dignity, my father and grandfather served them. How could I seek revenge against my sovereigns? Impressed by his loyalty and honesty, Genghis took him into his service. This scholar would become the conscience of the empire, the man who would famously tell the Khan, you can conquer the empire on horseback, but you cannot rule it from there. As the smoke of Zhongdu rose into the eternal blue sky, Genghis Khan turned his horse north. He had broken the back of the dragon. He left generals behind to finish the subjugation of the north, a slow grinding war that would last for decades. But the great Khan himself had other concerns. He had acquired wealth beyond the dreams of any steppe chieftain. He had acquired new weapons, the catapults, the fire lancers, the engineers. The horde that returned to the grasslands was no longer just a tribal confederation. It was a hybrid monster, possessing the speed of the nomad and the technology of the civilized world. They carried with them the realization that nothing, not even the highest walls built by the greatest empires, could stand against them. But fate, as it often does, was preparing a twist. The Mongols were content for the moment to digest their conquest. They sought trade, not war, with the powers to the west. Genghis Khan sent a massive caravan, a train of 500 camels, laden with the spoils of China, westward to the Khwarezmian Empire, the great Islamic power of Central Asia. It was a hand extended in friendship, or at least in profitable commerce. The message he sent to the Sultan Muhammad II was respectful, if slightly condescending. I am the master of the lands of the rising sun. You are the master of the lands of the setting sun. Let there be a firm treaty of friendship and peace between us. It was a golden opportunity for the Sultan. He could have been the bridge between East and West. Instead, in a moment of arrogance that would doom millions, the governor of a border city accused the merchants of being spies. He arrested them, seized their goods, and executed them. It was the medieval equivalent of shooting the ambassador. When Genghis heard the news, he did not explode in rage. He went to a sacred mountain, uncovered his head, and prayed to the sky for 3 days. When he descended, his face was set like stone. The time for trade was over. The force of nature had been provoked. The merchant's insult would unleash a scourge such as the world had never seen. turning the Mongol gaze from the dragon of the east to the ghosts of the west. The story now moves along the ancient dusty veins of the Silk Road, those lifelines of commerce that connected the heartbeat of China to the lungs of the Mediterranean. It was a world of caravanserai, stone inns where camels rested, and stories were traded like spices, a world that believed itself safe in the rhythm of buying and selling. But in the city of Otrar, a jewel of the Khwarezmian Empire situated on the banks of the Sirdarya River, a single act of greed was about to pull the thread that would unravel the entire tapestry of Central Asia. The governor of Otrar, a man named Inalshuk, looked upon the Mongol caravan of 1218 not as an embassy of peace, but as a chest of gold waiting to be cracked open. He saw the silks, the furs, and the silver, and his eyes, blinded by the glitter of short-term gain, missed the long shadow of the hawk circling above, accusing the merchants of espionage, a charge that historians still argue may have had a grain of truth. Given that Mongol merchants often doubled as scouts, he arrested them. But the true tragedy, the moment the door to hell was unlatched, came from the Sultan Muhammad II himself, when Genghis Khan, showing uncharacteristic restraint, sent 3 envoys to demand that the governor be punished and the goods returned. The Sultan made a choice that defies all logic of self-preservation. He shaved the beards of 2 envoys and beheaded the 3rd. In the culture of the steppe, where the guest is sacred and the ambassador is inviolable, this was not just a crime, it was a declaration that the laws of the universe no longer applied. It was a blasphemy against the sky itself. The reaction of Genghis Khan was not the hot, shouting anger of a man, but the cold, geologic shifting of a tectonic plate. He climbed to the summit of the sacred mountain Burkhan Khaldun, hat off, face to the wind, and spoke to the eternal blue sky. I am not the author of this trouble. Grant me strength to exact vengeance. The invasion that followed was a masterclass in psychological and strategic warfare that military colleges still study today with a mixture of awe and horror. The Khwarezmian Empire was vast, fielding an army of perhaps 400,000 men, far outnumbering the Mongol force. Sultan Muhammad, confident in his numbers, scattered his troops across the major cities, believing the Mongols would dash themselves against his walls like waves against a cliff. He expected a traditional raid. He did not expect the red sand. The Kizilkum Desert was considered impassable, a burning anvil where the sun hammered the life out of any traveller. It was the shield of the empire's rear, but Genghis Khan did not believe in impassable terrain. While one Mongol army attacked from the expected front to draw the Sultan's attention, Genghis himself, with his son Tolui, took a select force and vanished into the desert. For weeks, they were ghosts, surviving on dried curd and the blood of their horses, navigating by the stars. When they emerged from the shimmering heat haze, they were not in front of the Sultan's defences. They were behind them, standing before the gates of Bukhara, deep in the heart of the empire. The shock was absolute. It was as if an army had dropped from the moon. The citizens of Bukhara, seeing the impossible materialized before their eyes, felt the will to fight drain out of them like water from a cracked jar. The garrison tried to break out, but was cut down on the banks of the Amu Darya. The city opened its gates. What happened next is a scene etched into the collective nightmare of history. Genghis Khan rode into the great mosque of Bukhara, his horse's hooves clattering on the sacred tiles. He ascended the pulpit, the place where imams preached the word of God, and looked out at the trembling notables of the city. He did not shout. He spoke with the terrifying calm of a judge delivering a verdict. O people, know that you have committed great sins, and that the great ones among you have committed these sins. If you ask me what proof I have for these words, I say it is because I am the punishment of God. If you had not committed great sins, God would not have sent a punishment like me upon you. It was a moment of profound psychological dominance. He was framing his conquest not as a war, but as a divine correction. The city was stripped of its wealth, its grain, and its artisans. The wooden structures were put to the torch, and as the flames rose, they consumed not just the buildings, but the very idea of Khwarezmian invincibility. From Bukhara, the horde moved to the capital Samarkand. The Sultan, realizing his strategy of dispersed defense was a catastrophic failure, panicked. He had elephants, he had elite cavalry, but he had lost his nerve. He fled. The siege of Samarkand was brutal and short. The Mongols used prisoners from Bukhara as human shields, pushing them forward to absorb the arrows of the defenders, a cruel efficiency that forced the Khwarezmians to kill their own countrymen to reach the enemy. When the city fell, the destruction was methodical. The great irrigation canals that made the desert bloom were smashed, turning gardens back into dust. But the story of this invasion is not just about the cities, it is about the hunt. Genghis Khan detached two of his greatest generals, Jebi and Subutai, the dogs of war, and gave them a simple order. Find the Sultan. Do not stop. If he flies to the sky, become falcons. If he burrows into the earth, become badgers. What followed was one of the most dramatic chases in history. Sultan Muhammad II, the man who had called himself the Second Alexander, became a fugitive in his own kingdom. He fled west, riding from city to city, always looking over his shoulder, always seeing the dust cloud of the pursuing Tumans on the horizon. He abandoned his treasury, his family, and his dignity. The chase covered thousands of miles through the mountains of Iran and to the shores of the Caspian Sea. There, on a small desolate island, the ruler of the setting sun took his final breath. He did not die in battle. He died of pleurisy and exhaustion, wrapped in rags, so poor that he had to be buried in the shirt of one of his few remaining servants. It was a lonely, pathetic end for the man who had sparked the fire. Meanwhile, back in Otrar, the governor Inalchuk held out for 5 months in the citadel, fighting with the desperation of a man who knows his fate. When he was finally captured, legend says that the Mongols, with a sense of poetic irony, poured molten silver into his eyes and ears, drowning him in the very wealth he had coveted. While modern historians debate the veracity of this silver execution, suggesting it might be a later moralizing fable added by Persian chroniclers, the message it conveys is the true historical reality. The Mongols were not just conquerors, they were the karma of the steppe. They visited upon their enemies the exact shape of their own sins. The scourge had arrived, and as the smoke drifted over the ruins of the Khwarezmian Empire, the world began to realize that the old maps were burning. The Mongols now stood on the edge of the west, peering into the unknown lands of Russia and Europe, and the generals Jebe and Subutai, having run out of Sultan to chase, looked at the horizon and asked, what lies beyond? The wind blowing off the Caspian Sea is cold and salty, stinging the eyes of the two men who stand on the shoreline, looking not back toward home, but forward into the unknown. Jebe and Subutai, the dogs of war, have completed their mission. The Sultan is dead, his empire shattered. By all rights, they should turn their horses east and return to the comfort of the felt tents and the praise of the Khan, but these are men whose souls are forged from the horizon itself. To them, an unmapped map is an insult. They send a rider back to Genghis with a request that sounds insane to settled ears, but perfectly logical to a Mongol. Let us ride west. Let us see what nations lie under the setting sun, break their pride, and return. The Khan, trusting his wolves, agrees. Thus begins the Great Raid, a 3-year reconnaissance mission of 5,000 miles that is arguably the greatest cavalry exploit in human history. They are not an invasion force, they are merely a scouting party, 20,000 ghosts riding into the mists of the Caucasus. To reach the west, they must first do the impossible. Cross the Caucasus Mountains in winter. The peaks here are jagged teeth biting the sky, the passes choked with snow. They fight their way through, dragging their horses over ice-slicked precipices, surviving on frozen meat and sheer will. When they burst out onto the steppes of what is today southern Russia and Ukraine, they are hungry, tired, and utterly lethal. They first encounter the Georgians, a kingdom of proud Christian knights who ride with the heavy splendour of the crusading tradition. The Georgians see the tattered, leather-clad nomads and assume this will be an easy victory for the cross. They are wrong. Subutai plays them like a fiddle, using a feigned retreat to stretch their heavy cavalry out until the knights are exhausted, their horses blown. Then the Mongols turn. The Georgian army, the flower of the Caucasus, is cut down in a single afternoon. The Mongols do not linger. They ride on, a storm moving north. Panic spreads ahead of them like the scent of smoke. The Cumans, a nomadic Turkish people who have long raided the Russian lands, flee in terror. Their leader, Kotian, gallops to the court of his son-in-law, Mstislav the Bold, a powerful Russian prince. Kotian tears his clothes and cries out, "Today they have taken our land. Tomorrow they will take yours." The princes of the Rus, a collection of squabbling city-states including Kiev, Chernigov, and Galicia, are shaken. They have never heard of these Mongols. They call them Tartars, a name that evokes Tartarus, the hell of Greek mythology. To the medieval Russian mind, these are not men. They are demons burst from the underworld, punishment for their sins. Despite their fear, or perhaps because of it, the Russian princes gather a massive coalition. They march out into the steppe, their armour gleaming, their banners snapping, an army of perhaps 80,000 men, confident in their numbers and their god. They find the Mongols near the banks of the Kalka River in May 1223. What follows is a tragedy of arrogance and misunderstanding. The Mongols, seeing the massive Rus host, employ their signature tactic, the Mangu Dai, the feigned retreat. They turn their horses and run. For 9 days they flee. The Rus' princes, emboldened, give chase. "Look," they cry, "the demons are cowards. Let us run them down." The Russian army stretches out over miles of steppe, the fast cavalry far ahead of the slow infantry, the discipline dissolving in the thrill of the hunt. They do not realize they are being led by the nose. On the 9th day, the Mongols cross the Kalka River and stop. They wheel their horses around. The cowards are gone. In their place is a wall of silence and iron. Subutai signals the attack. The heavy Mongol lancers, the armoured fist of the horde, smash into the disordered Russian vanguard. It is not a battle, it is a collision of realities. The light Russian cavalry is shattered instantly, and they flee backward, crashing into their own infantry, who are still marching up, creating a chaotic crush of men and horses. The Mongols surround the confused mass, their arrows darkening the sky like a plague of locusts. The slaughter is absolute. The river turns red, clogged with the bodies of the finest warriors of the Rus. But the true horror, the moment that sears itself into the Russian soul for eternity, comes after the fighting stops. The princes of Kiev, who had surrendered under a promise of safe conduct, a promise the Mongols technically keep by their own twisted logic, claiming they promised not to spill their blood, are gathered together. The Mongols dig a large pit or trench and lay the bound princes at the bottom. Over them they construct a heavy wooden platform, and then the victors feast. Close your eyes and try to push away the image, but the history insists. Imagine the sound of heavy boots stomping on the wooden planks, the clinking of cups, the throat singing rising into the night air as the Mongols celebrate their victory. And beneath the floorboards, the muffled groans, the cracking of ribs, the slow, suffocating crushing of the Russian nobility. It is a feast on the planks, a grotesque theatre of dominance. Historians still argue whether this specific method of execution was a ritual sacrifice to the spirits of the earth or simply a terrifying psychological message that the Mongols were so far above the aristocracy of the West that they could literally dine on top of them. The message is clear. Your titles, your lineage, your god, none of it matters. We are the new reality. Having destroyed the armies of the Rus and peered into the edges of Europe, Jebi and Subutai do the unthinkable. They leave. They do not occupy the cities. They do not garrison the castles. They simply vanish back into the east like a bad dream at dawn. The survivors in Kiev and Novgorod are left bewildered. Who were they? Why did they come? Where did they go? A chronicler writes, "They came, no one knows from where, and they went, no one knows where." But Subutai knows. He is returning to the Khan with a map in his mind. He has seen the pastures of Ukraine. He has tested the steel of the European knights and found it brittle. He has planted the seeds of a future harvest. The great raid is over. But as the Mongols ride back toward the rising sun to reunite with Genghis, they leave behind a silence that is heavier than before. The ghosts in the West have not disappeared. They have merely gone to fetch the rest of the pack. The world has been scouted. The target has been marked. And back in the East, the old wolf Genghis Khan listens to their report with a satisfied nod, knowing that his legacy will stretch further than his eyes can see, even as his own time on the earth begins to draw to a close. The wind that carved the canyons of the steppe now carved the deep lines in the face of the great Khan. It is the year 1226, and the force of nature is beginning to feel the weight of mortality. Genghis Khan is over 60 years old, a lifetime in the harsh mathematics of the saddle. He has conquered more of the world than Alexander or Caesar, yet there is a restlessness in him, an itch that silence cannot scratch. The Western Shia, the Tangut kingdom that sits on the fringes of the Silk Road, has failed to send troops for the Western campaigns, a betrayal of the feudal bond that the Khan holds sacred. To Genghis, loyalty is not a political convenience, it is the gravity that holds the universe together. If the Tanguts can defy him, the centre will not hold. So, despite his age, despite the aching in his joints, the old wolf rises one last time. He summons the banners. He mounts his horse, but the body, unlike the spirit, is made of earth and water, and it can break. The secret history of the Mongols tells us that during a winter hunt, his horse, startled by wild asses, reared and threw the great Khan to the frozen ground. Pain, like a hot iron, seized him. His generals urged him to return home, to rest, to let the young wolves finish the kill. But Genghis looked at them with eyes that had seen cities burn and empires crumble and refused. "If we go back now," he rasped, "the Tanguts will say we are afraid." The campaign would go on. He would ride to his death rather than live in the shadow of weakness. The narrative camera moves slowly now, entering the dim, smoky interior of the Khan's great felt tent in August 1227. The heat of the Yinchuan summer presses against the felt, but inside the air is cold with the presence of the end. Genghis Khan lies on a bed of furs, his breathing shallow. Outside, his army is dismantling the Tangut capital, erasing the Western Shia from history so completely that their language will be lost for centuries. But inside, the conquest is over. The Khan calls his sons. Jochi is already dead, a shadow of grief that haunts the father. But Ogadai, Chagatai, and Tolui are there, or perhaps present in spirit as the old man speaks his final will. He recounts the parable of the arrows, a lesson from his own ancestor Alan Gua. A single arrow can be broken by a child, but a bundle of arrows bound together, is unbreakable. If you are separated, he whispers, his voice like dry leaves, you will be broken like a single shaft. But if you remain together, the world is yours. It is a plea for unity from a man who knows that the only thing that can defeat the Mongols is the Mongols themselves. He names Ogedi, the third son, the diplomat, as his successor, choosing temperament over military genius, stability over fire. And then, as the sun dips below the mountains of the Hexi corridor, the breath leaves the body of the universal ruler. The oceanic leader returns to the stillness of the deep. What follows is one of the most cinematic and mysterious sequences in human history, the long march home. The army is ordered to keep his death a secret. If the world knows the Khan is dead, the empire might fracture, the Tanguts might rebel, the enemies might rise. So the death becomes a ghost story. His body is placed in a cart, perhaps bathed in milk and juniper to preserve it, or perhaps sealed in a coffin of fragrant wood. The procession begins the long trek back to the sacred heartland of Mongolia, to the Burkhan Khaldun, the mountain where he had prayed as a young outcast. And here, the history turns into a dark myth, a tangled, painful chapter of absolute devotion and absolute brutality. The legends say that the funeral escort, the Keshig guard, was given a terrible order: let nothing disturb the sleep of the Khan. As the procession moved through the steppes, anyone who saw it, shepherds, travellers, entire villages, was put to the sword. They were sent ahead to serve their master in the afterlife, silenced so that no tongue could wag, no rumour could spread. The birds stopped singing, the dogs ceased barking. A corridor of silence was carved across Asia, a void moving north, protecting the final secret of the man who had shaken the world. They brought him finally to the great taboo, the Ikkorig, a forbidden zone around the sacred mountain. Here, the boundary between myth and fact dissolves completely. Historians still argue about the precise location and method of his burial. Some chronicles say 2,000 servants were killed after burying him, and then the soldiers who killed them were killed in turn, a nesting doll of death to seal the truth. Others claimed that 1,000 horses were driven back and forth over the grave until the ground was flat and the grass was beaten into the earth, indistinguishable from the surrounding plain. Some even whisper that a river was diverted to flow over the tomb, sealing him under the rushing waters forever. The goal was achieved. Today, despite modern technology, satellite imagery, and endless expeditions, the grave of Genghis Khan has never been found. He vanished into the landscape he loved. He became the mountain. He became the river. He refused to be a monument that could be defaced or worshipped. He chose to be the land itself. But while his body was hidden in the earth, his soul, according to Mongol belief, did not go down. It went up. It entered the Sulda, the spirit banner, the nine-tailed white banner that had been raised in 1296, the standard that had tasted the dust of China and the snow of Russia, became the repository of his genius, his luck, his Sueld. The Mongols believed that as long as the banner flew, the Khan was present. He was not gone, he was simply unseen. The weeping of the people was not just for a king, but for a father. The force of nature had returned to the elements. The era of the founder was over. The silence of the burial ground stands in stark contrast to the noise of the empire he left behind, a machine of conquest that was still accelerating. The sons, wiping their tears, looked at the bundle of arrows. They looked at the map. The old wolf was dead, but the pack was still hungry. The secret burial was not an end, but a terrifying pause, a deep breath before the scream. The ghost in the west had gone to sleep, but his dreams were about to become the nightmares of Europe. The banner snapped in the wind, pointing not back to the grave, but forward to the stone cities that still stood, arrogant and unaware, on the edge of the Mongol world. The wind that swept over the secret grave of the father now swirls into the valley of the Orkhon, where the son has decided to do the impossible. He has decided to anchor the wind. We drift forward in time to the year 1235, leaving the silent mountains for the bustling, chaotic, paradoxical heart of the new empire. This is Karakorum, the Black Gravel, the capital city of Ögedei Khan. It is a place that defies the logic of the steppe, a city built by nomads who hate walls, a permanent anchor for a people who worship movement. The camera of our mind glides over the low earthen walls that are largely symbolic for who would dare attack the centre of the world, and descends into streets that smell of roasting mutton, incense, wet felt, and the sweat of 1,000 horses. It is a city of tents solidified into mud brick and timber, a city of felt that has decided to stay for dinner. Ögedei, the third son of Genghis, is the master here. He is a man of different temperament than his father. Where Genghis was the cold iron of the sword, Ögedei is the warm velvet of the scabbard. He is jovial, generous to a fault, and possessed of a laugh that shakes the tent poles. He realizes that you cannot rule a world empire from a saddle forever. Eventually, you need a desk, a warehouse, and a place to store the tribute that is pouring in from the corners of the earth. And so, Karakorum rises from the grassland like a mirage, a cosmopolitan oddity where the ends of the earth meet to drink tea. At the centre of this swirling vortex stands the Palace of World Peace, Ögedei's royal pavilion. It is not the stone fortress of a paranoid European king, but a forest of pillars painted in gold and lacquer, roofed with green and red tiles that shimmer like dragon scales in the Mongolian sun. But the true wonder, the object that captures the imagination of every traveller who stumbles into this court, is not the building itself, but the machine inside it. Stand here in the cool shade of the hall and look at the silver tree. Crafted by the captured Parisian goldsmith Guillaume Boucher, a man plucked from the streets of Europe to serve the Khan, it is a masterpiece of hydraulic engineering and artistic whimsy. The tree is made of solid silver, its branches stretching up to the ceiling. At its base are 4 silver lions that vomit mare's milk into basins. Winding up the trunk are 4 pipes that lead to the mouths of gilded serpents. When the Khan signals, a servant blows a trumpet, and the internal mechanics wheeze and click, and suddenly the tree comes alive. From the mouths of the serpents pour 4 different streams: wine from the vineyards of Persia, mead from the honey halls of the north, rice wine from the rice paddies of China, and ayrag, the fermented milk of the steppe. It is a fountain of global intoxication, a physical manifestation of the Pax Mongolica. The guests, envoys from the Pope, princes from Russia, merchants from India, rush to fill their cups, catching the liquid wealth of the empire in silver goblets. It is said that Ögedei loved this tree not just for the engineering, but for the product. The great Khan was a man of immense thirst, a lover of the cup whose drinking bouts were legendary. When his advisor, Yelu Chukai, the tall scholar with the beard, warned him that wine was eroding his health like water erodes a stone, showing him a rusted iron cup as proof, Ögedei nodded solemnly. He promised to limit himself to a certain number of cups a day, but being a man of loophole logic, he simply commissioned a cup that was twice as big. The court that drinks from this tree is a liquid court in more ways than one. It is a place of fluid identities. Walk through the muddy streets of Karakorum, and you will hear a babble of tongues: Uyghur, Persian, Chinese, Russian, Latin. Here, a Buddhist monk in saffron robes debates theology with a Nestorian Christian priest and a Muslim imam, while the Khan watches with amusement, betting on who will lose their temper first. This religious tolerance is not born of modern liberalisms, but of pragmatic superstition and imperial confidence. The Mongols believe in the sky, but they are terrified of offending any local god who might have power. Why risk angering Jesus or Allah or Buddha when you can just ask all of them to pray for the Khan? It is an insurance policy of the soul. In this city of felt, the first international bureaucracy is being born. Scribes sit cross-legged, brushes flying over paper, translating the Khan's grunts into edicts that will move armies 3,000 miles away. They use the Uyghur script to write the Mongol language, creating a paper trail that binds the empire tighter than any rope. The Yam, the Pony Express system, terminates here. A rider can gallop from the banks of the Danube to the gates of Karakorum in weeks, carrying news of rebellions or harvests. It is the internet of the 13th century, a web of information that vibrates with the pulse of the world. But beneath the silver leaves and the flow of wine, there is a steel undercurrent. Ugadi is not just partying, he is planning. The force of nature is resting, but it has not stopped. The tribute that flows into the city, the cartloads of silk, the bags of gold dust, is fuel. The Khan sits on his throne, wrapped in furs, his face flushed with drink, but his eyes are clear when he looks at the maps spread out on the carpet. The conquest of China is grinding on, a slow digestion of the dragon. But the generals, the old wolves like Subutai, are bored. They look at the silver tree and see a toy. They look at the walls and see a cage. They want the open sky. They remember the Great Raid. They remember the smell of the western lands. And so in 1235, amidst the music and the feasting, Ogeda makes a decision that will stop the heart of Europe. He authorises a new campaign, a massive westward expansion, not just to raid, but to conquer. He gives the command to his nephew Batu, a man with a face like a thunderstorm, and pairs him with the old master, Subutai. The goal is the Great Sea in the west, the Atlantic. They are to ride until they run out of land. As the order is written down, stamped with the red seal of the Khan, the Tamgar, the music of the silver tree seems to change key, becoming less a song of celebration and more a martial rhythm. The bustling streets of Karakorum, with their Parisian smiths and Chinese scribes, are merely the engine room. The ship is turning. The Golden Horde is about to be born, not in the comfort of the palace, but in the blood and snow of the West. The camera lingers one last time on the silver lions vomiting milk, a symbol of plenty, before panning out to the horse lines outside the city, where thousands of ponies are being shod, their breath steaming in the cold air, unaware that they will soon be drinking from the Danube. The city of felt has spoken. The storm is moving west. The wind that howls through the birch forests of Russia is different from the wind of the steppe. It is a mournful sound, whistling through the bare branches of winter like a choir of ghosts. We've moved forward to the winter of 1237, a season so cold that the very air seems to crack like glass. The camera of our mind drifts over a landscape that should be impenetrable to a nomadic army, a world of dense dark forests and deep snowdrifts. But the Mongols, led by the grandson of Genghis, Batu Khan, and the old master Subutai, have turned the season into a weapon. They have waited for the rivers to freeze, the Volga, the Oka, the Don. These are no longer barriers, they are highways of ice, paved by nature for the hooves of the Mongol ponies. The Golden Horde, though not yet called by that name, moves like a dark stain across the white canvas of the north. They are a force of nature that has learned to thrive in the 0-degree stillness. The Russian princes, squabbling in their wooden citadels, believe themselves safe until spring. They are wrong. The first shadow falls upon the city of Ryazan. The Mongol envoys arrive at the gates, their breath steaming, demanding the customary tribute. 1/10 of everything, 1/10 of your gold, 1/10 of your horses, 1/10 of your people. The princes of Ryazan, proud and perhaps tragically optimistic about their wooden walls, reply with a line that belongs in a Norse saga: "When we are gone, everything will be yours." It is a brave refusal, but bravery without ballistics is a dangerous thing. The Mongols do not storm the walls immediately. They build a fence around the city, a wooden noose that tightens by the hour. Then the catapults begin to sing. For 5 days, the sky rains fire and stone. The wooden walls, strong against arrows, splinter under the weight of boulders the size of tavern tables. Ryazan falls, and the silence that follows is absolute. The 10th is taken, and then the rest is taken too, leaving only a smoking scar in the snow. The horde moves on, a relentless machine of conquest. They are not just raiding, they are hunting the very idea of resistance. Grand Prince Yuri of Vladimir, the most powerful of the northern princes, leaves his capital to gather an army in the deep forests, hoping to ambush the invaders. But Subutai is not a man who can be ambushed. He is the one who knocks. The Mongols track Yuri to the Sit River. The battle there is fought in a blinding blizzard, a swirl of white snow and red blood, where visibility is zero, and death comes from nowhere. The Russian army is not just defeated, it is erased. The Grand Prince's headless body is found later by a bishop, identified only by his royal garments. It is a moment of horror that freezes the soul of the Rus. The cities of Vladimir, Suzdal, and Moscow, then a minor trading post of little consequence, burn one by one. The Mongol winter has come, and it consumes everything, but even amidst the destruction there are moments of strange humanity and myth. The city of Kozelsk holds out for 7 weeks, fighting so fiercely that the Mongols call it the City of Evil because they lost so many men taking it. When it finally falls, they are so impressed by the ferocity of the defenders that they slaughter everyone to honour the fight, a twisted form of respect that only a warrior culture could devise. Or perhaps they were just really annoyed. The narrative camera pans south now to the year 1240, to the jewel of the Dnieper, the mother of Russian cities, Kiev. It is a metropolis of golden domes and white stone, a rival to Constantinople, sitting on the high banks of the river like a crown. The Mongol commander, Mengu, riding ahead of the main force, stops on the opposite bank and just stares. He is captivated by the beauty of the city, the way the sun catches the gold of the Church of the Tithes and the Cathedral of St. Sophia. He offers terms of surrender, sparing the city if they open the gates. The Kievans, perhaps believing that their massive walls and the prayers of their saints will save them, throw the envoys from the walls. It is the same mistake, repeated with the same tragic inevitability. Batu Khan arrives with the main host, and the noise is described by chroniclers as being so loud that no man could hear his own voice. The squealing of the ungreased axles of thousands of carts, the bellowing of camels, yes, camels in the snow, the neighing of horses and the chanting of the warriors creates a wall of sound that shakes the mortar in the bricks. The siege engines are assembled. These are not the crude devices of the steppe. They are mathematical instruments of destruction designed by Chinese and Persian engineers. They find the weak point in the Polish gate. The walls crumble. The final stand of Kiev is a scene of heartbreaking pathos. As the Mongols pour into the city, the defenders and civilians retreat to the Church of the Tithes, the oldest stone church in Russia. They pack into the nave, the balconies, the sanctuary, praying for a miracle. Others climb onto the roof, carrying their possessions, their weight so great that the stone walls, weakened by the battering rams and the heat of the fires, begin to groan. And then with a sound like a thunderclap that cracks the earth, the church collapses, the dome falls in. The sanctuary becomes a tomb. The silence returns to the Dnieper, The fall of Kiev marks the effective end of the old Kievan Rus. The golden yoke descends upon the land. Historians still argue fiercely about the nature of this yoke. Was it a period of pure darkness, a barbaric dampener that cut Russia off from the Renaissance and the light of Europe, freezing it in time? Or was it the crucible that forged the modern Russian state? For the Mongols did not occupy the Russian forests. They hated the trees, feeling claustrophobic in the woods. They preferred the open steppe of the south. So they established a system of tributary vassalage. They gave the surviving princes a patent to rule, the Yarlik, but only if they bowed the knee and paid the tax. This system empowered the princes who were most willing to collaborate, most willing to collect taxes for the Khans. It was this system that would eventually allow Moscow to rise from the ashes, consolidating power by being the best tax collector for the Horde. The yoke was a heavy, suffocating blanket, but it was also a shield. Alexander Nevsky, the Prince of Novgorod, the man who defeated the Teutonic Knights on the ice, looked at the Mongols and made a cold calculation. He realized he could not fight the force of nature in the east. So he submitted to Batu, becoming his son in order to save his people from the west. He famously said, "God is not in power, but in truth," but his truth was one of survival. The Mongols, in turn, left the Orthodox Church alone, exempting priests from taxes because they feared the power of the Russian God. This allowed the Church to become the repository of Russian identity during the long darkness. As the smoke clears over the ruins of Kiev, we see a changed landscape. The proud, fractious city-states are gone. In their place is a silent, brooding land, paying tribute to a distant capital on the Volga. The survivors emerge from the forests, looking at the hoofprints in the snow, realizing that their world has tilted on its axis. But Batu Khan does not look back at the ruins. He stands on the westernmost hill of Kiev, wiping the soot from his face, and looks toward the setting sun. He sees the plains of Poland. He sees the mountains of Hungary. He sees the rich, untouched lands of Latin Christendom. The crushing of Rus was not the destination. It was merely the clearing of the path. The ghost in the west is hungry for more. The ponies are rested. The quivers are full. The wind blows west, and the Horde rides with it. The wind carries the scent of burning thatch and spilled iron across the Carpathians, blowing away the last shreds of European complacency. It is the spring of 1241, and the Mongol winter has not ended. It has simply moved south, transforming into a thunderhead of hooves and arrows that looms over the heart of Christendom. The camera of our mind shifts from the ruins of Kiev to the green, rolling fields of Poland and the Pannonian basin of Hungary. Here, the kings and dukes sit in their stone castles, secure in their mail armour and their feudal arrogance, believing that the Tartars are merely a disorganised rabble of savages who got lucky against the Russians. They view war as a ritual of chivalry, a heavy collision of lance and shield, a contest of honour. They do not understand that they are about to face a contest of mathematics. Batu Khan and Subutai, resting their horses on the border, have devised a strategic masterpiece, a pincer movement that would make a modern general weep with envy. They divide the force of nature into two streams. The right flank, a smaller diversionary force led by Baida and Kadan, sweeps north into Poland to draw out the defenders and prevent them from aiding the south. The main host, the Hammer, rides with Subutai toward Hungary. It is a coordination of armies separated by hundreds of miles, communicating without radios, synchronized by the rhythm of the pony express riders and the sheer genius of the Mongol command structure. On April 9th, 1241, the northern stream crashes into the forces of Duke Henry the Pious at Legnica. Henry has gathered a coalition of Polish knights, Bavarian miners, and historians still argue fiercely about this, possibly a contingent of the Teutonic Knights, the elite warrior monks of the Baltic. The presence of the Teutonic Knights at Legnica is one of those stubborn historical myths that refuses to die, appearing in paintings and legends, though contemporary records are suspiciously silent on their white mantles. Whether they were there or not, the result would have been the same. The European heavy cavalry is a fearsome beast, a wall of steel capable of smashing through anything in a straight line, but the Mongols do not fight in straight lines, as the knights charge, thundering across the field with Dieu est mon droit on their lips. The Mongol light cavalry simply drifts away. They scatter like mist, firing arrows backward over their saddles. The knights, heavy and enraged, chase them, their formation breaking apart, their horses tiring in the soft spring mud. And then the trap snaps shut. The Mongol heavy lancers, who have been waiting in the smoke, yes, the Mongols used burning reeds to create smoke screens, a form of medieval chemical warfare, emerge like demons. The tinned meat of the European nobility is cracked open. Duke Henry is killed, his head paraded on a spear to terrorise the countryside. The Mongols fill 9 sacks with the ears of the fallen, a gruesome accounting method that sends a shiver of horror all the way to Paris. But Legnica is just the sideshow. 2 days later, on April 11th, the main event unfolds on the banks of the Sarjo River in Hungary. King Bela I has gathered the might of the Hungarian kingdom, an army that outnumbers the Mongols, consisting of perhaps 60,000 to 80,000 men. They are camped on the west bank, guarding the only stone bridge across the river, confident that the nomads cannot cross the deep waters. They have created a massive wagon fort, a city of wooden carts chained together, believing it to be impregnable. But they have forgotten that they are fighting Subutai, the man who crossed the Alps in winter and the Gobi in summer. Subutai looks at the bridge and sees not a barrier, but a bottleneck in the dead of night, while Batu engages the Hungarians at the bridge with catapults and fire lances, thunderous weapons that terrify the European horses. Subutai takes a large force and rides south. He finds a ford, or perhaps builds a pontoon bridge of timber and inflated skins in the darkness. As the sun rises and the Hungarians are focused on holding the stone bridge against Batu, a horn sounds from their flank. Subutai has arrived. The Battle of Mohi is not a battle, it is an extermination. The Hungarians, panicked by the sudden appearance of the enemy behind them, retreat into their wagon fort. It is exactly what Subutai wants. He surrounds the camp, not attacking, but bombarding it with stone and fire. The camp becomes a slaughterhouse, a claustrophobic nightmare of screaming men and burning wagons. And then the Mongols do something that reveals their terrifying understanding of human psychology. They leave a gap. They open a small hole in their lines to the west, a gate of life. The desperate Hungarian soldiers see it and think, a chance. We can escape. They stream out of the wagon fort, dropping their weapons to run faster, their unit cohesion dissolving into a primal stampede for survival. But the gap is not a mercy. It is a funnel. The Mongols wait until the soldiers are strung out along the road, exhausted and defenceless, and then they ride them down. It is a harvest of blood. The road back to Pest is littered with bodies for days. King Bela escapes by the skin of his teeth, fleeing to the islands of the Adriatic, chased by Mongol scouts who ride their horses into the surf, staring hungrily at the boat carrying the monarch away. The aftermath of these two battles is a silence that rings louder than the clash of swords. In the span of 3 days, the military power of Central Europe has been annihilated. The whirlwind has torn the roof off the continent. The Mongols spend the rest of the year raiding, burning, and consolidating. They cross the frozen Danube in the winter of 1241-1242, their horses' hooves clicking on the ice, and sack the cities of Buda and Pest. There is a story, perhaps apocryphal but emotionally true, of the Mongols issuing a decree that the peasantry should return to their fields to harvest the crops, promising safety. The peasants, desperate and starving, return, and once the harvest is gathered, the Mongols return and harvest the peasants. It is a cold, calculated pragmatism. The army needs food, and the people are merely tools to get it. Europe is in a state of absolute panic. The Holy Roman Emperor is writing frantic letters. The Pope is calling for a crusade that no one is able to fight. The chronicler Matthew Paris writes, "The Tartars have noses like dogs, and eat the bodies of the dead." They are no longer seen as an army, but as the end times, the legions of Gog and Magog released to scour the earth. There is literally nothing stopping them. The road to Vienna is open. The road to Venice is open. The road to the Atlantic is open. The force of nature stands on the precipice of total victory, ready to dip its banners in the English Channel. The knights are dead, the kings are running, and the winter snow is red. But just as the hammer is raised for the final blow, something happens in the far, far east. A whisper in the wind. A single heartbeat that stops, that will change history more than any sword. The year is 1242, and the air over Vienna is thick with the scent of fear, a palpable musk that seems to sweat from the very stones of the city walls. The Holy Roman Empire, a construct often joked about for being neither holy, nor Roman, nor much of an empire, is trembling in its iron boots. The scouts have reported the smoke rising in the east. The refugees from Hungary have brought tales of the devil's horsemen who move faster than the wind and strike harder than thunder. The residents of Vienna, and indeed all of Western Europe, are preparing for the end of the world, hoarding grain, sharpening rusty swords, and writing wills that they suspect will never be read. The force of nature is camped just across the Danube, a coiled viper ready to strike at the jugular of the West. Batu Khan and Subutai sit in their felt tent, the maps of Italy and Germany spread before them, plotting the final strokes of a campaign that has been a masterpiece of violence. They can practically taste the salt air of the Atlantic. They can envision the plunder of Rome. There is nothing standing in their way, no army, no king, no river that they cannot cross. The sheer inevitability of the Mongol conquest hangs over the continent like a guillotine blade, waiting for gravity to do its work. But gravity, it turns out, has a sense of humour. Thousands of miles away, in the city of Felt, Karakorum, the butterfly flaps its wings, or rather, the great Khan lifts his cup one too many times. On December 11th, 1241, Ogedei Khan, the jovial, generous, and insatiable ruler of the world, went on a hunting trip. He was joined by his favourite drinking companion, Abd al-Rahman, and together they engaged in a heroic battle against a substantial quantity of wine. Ogedei, who had once promised his brother Chagatai that he would reduce the number of cups he drank daily, had kept his word technically, if not spiritually, by simply using a cup the size of a bucket. But on this night, even the bucket was not enough, or perhaps it was too much. The great Khan drank himself into a stupor and never woke up. The Lord of the Earth was felled not by an assassin's dagger or a soldier's arrow, but by a stroke or organ failure brought on by his own excess. He died as he lived, surrounded by friends, holding a cup, and leaving a massive mess for everyone else to clean up. The news of his death did not travel at the speed of light, but it travelled at the speed of the Yam, the Mongol Pony Express. Riders, wrapped tight against the biting winter wind, bells jingling on their harnesses to warn station keepers to have fresh horses ready, galloped night and day across the breadth of Asia. They rode until they bled, changing horses every 20 miles, carrying the message that would save civilization. The falcon has fallen, the council is called. The message reached the Mongol camp on the Danube in the early spring of 1242. The effect was instantaneous and paralysing. Under the Yasa, the law of Genghis Khan, when the great ruler dies, all the princes of the blood must return to the heartland for the Kurultai to elect the new Khan. It is a constitutional crisis that overrides all military objectives. Batu Khan, who stood on the verge of becoming the conqueror of Europe, stared at the message with what must have been a mixture of fury and resignation. He was not just a general, he was a politician, and he knew that if he stayed in Europe while the other princes gathered in Mongolia, he would be cut out of the succession and likely stripped of his power. The throne was up for grabs, and he needed to be there to ensure his branch of the family, the lineage of Jochi, was not sidelined by the ambitious sons of Ogjedi and Chagatai. Subutai, the old dog of war, likely argued to stay, to finish the job, to crush the last resistance before returning. To leave now was to leave the painting half finished. It was to walk away from the table when you held a royal flush. But the law was the law. The force of nature had to obey the wind from the east. However, we must pause here for a moment of scholarly intrigue. Historians still argue fiercely whether the death of Ogedai was the only reason the Mongols turned back. A compelling modern theory suggests that environmental factors played a crucial role. The Pannonian Basin of Hungary, while grassy, is not infinite. Some scholars calculate that the massive Mongol herds, 5 horses for every soldier, had simply eaten the grass down to the roots during the dry summer and cold winter. The force of nature was running out of fuel. The marshes were boggy, the fodder was scarce, and the logistics of feeding 100,000 men and 500,000 horses in the dense forests of Western Europe were becoming a nightmare. Perhaps Batu used the death of the Khan as a convenient political excuse to abandon a campaign that was reaching its logistical limit. It is the classic debate of great man history versus grass and mud history. Was it the death of a king or the lack of a lawn that saved Paris? The truth, as always, is likely a blend of both, a convenient death providing an exit ramp for an overextended army. Regardless of the reason, the result was a miracle. One morning, the sentries on the walls of the Austrian border towns looked out and saw nothing. The smoke was fading. The tents were gone. The thunder of hooves was retreating to the east. The Mongols did not just leave quietly, of course. That wasn't their style. They conducted a fighting retreat through Bulgaria and Serbia, sacking cities and taking slaves as a sort of parting gift, a reminder that they were leaving by choice, not by defeat. But they were leaving. The pressure on the throat of Christendom vanished. The Pope, the Emperor, and the kings of the West could scarcely believe their luck. They declared it a divine intervention, a miracle from God, unaware that their salvation came from a liver failure in Mongolia. This moment, this sudden receding of the tide, is one of the great what-ifs of history. For had Ogedai lived another 10 years, or even another 2, it is almost certain that the Mongols would have reached the Atlantic. The cathedrals of Paris might have been burned. The Vatican might have been turned into a stable. The Renaissance might have been strangled in the crib. The genetic and cultural map of Europe would look profoundly different today, but the tide did recede. Subutai, the genius who conquered 32 nations and won 65 pitched battles, turned his horse around with a heavy heart, leaving the spires of Vienna untouched. He would never return. He would die in retirement back in Mongolia, a warrior who ran out of time before he ran out of enemies. The divine wind had blown, but in reverse, saving the target by blowing the storm away. The Mongols withdrew to the Volga, to the steppes of Russia, where the grass was tall and the politics was safer. Europe was left bruised, battered and traumatized, gazing into the dark east with a newfound terror that would last for centuries. They began to build stone walls, to study the travelogues of friars sent to spy on the horde, to try and understand this alien force. But the immediate threat was over. The Mongol moment for Western Europe had passed, saved by the fragility of a single human life. As the dust settles on the horizon, we leave the bewildered knights of Europe lowering their drawbridges and turn our eyes back to the east, where Batu Khan is not just retreating, but stopping. He is tired of the long commute to Mongolia. He looks at the rich grasslands of the Volga, the trade routes of the Silk Road, and decides that if he cannot be the great Khan of the world, he will be the king of the Golden Tent. The Golden Horde is about to stop being an army and start being an empire. The wind that ripples the surface of the Volga River is softer than the biting gales of the steppe or the icy breath of the Russian winter. It is a breeze heavy with the scent of river mud, drying fish, and the sweet, grassy perfume of the Pontic steppe in summer. We have drifted south and east, away from the nervous stone castles of Europe, to the fertile delta, where the great river meets the Caspian Sea. It is the mid-13th century, and the frenetic energy of conquest has settled into the deep, rhythmic breathing of governance. Here, on the banks of the Volga, the force of nature has done something unexpected. It has put down roots. Batu Khan, the grandson of Genghis, the conqueror of Rosses, and the terror of Hungary, has tired of the endless saddle. He has claimed his inheritance, the Ulus of Jochi, the westernmost portion of the Mongol Empire, and transformed it into a state that history will know by a name that shimmers with both wealth and menace, the Golden Horde. But before we enter the city, let us clear the mist of language. The word horde does not mean a swarm of chaotic savages, as European chroniclers trembling in their monasteries would have you believe. It comes from the Turkic word ordu, meaning camp or headquarters. And golden, historians still argue whether this referred to the actual colour of Batu's royal tent, covered in gilded fabrics that blazed like a second sun against the green grass, or if it was a symbolic directional colour. In steppe cosmology, gold or yellow represented the centre, the imperial heart. Either way, the name stuck, whispering of a kingdom where the grass was power and the tents were palaces. The camera of our mind zooms in on this golden camp, which is rapidly evolving into the city of Sarai. It is a metropolis of anomalies. While the Mongols still prefer to sleep in their felt jers, realizing that a house is just a tomb you live in before you die, the artisans, merchants, and diplomats they have gathered need roofs. And so, Sarai becomes a sprawling hybrid. Broad avenues of beaten earth run between rows of white felt tents and districts of fired brick and timber. You can hear the rhythmic clanging of smiths forging not just swords but ploughshares and jewellery. You can smell the distinct aromas of a dozen cultures blending in the pot. Roasting mutton from the Turkic quarters, baking bread from the Russian Slavs, spiced stews from the Persian merchants. It is a city that can pack up and move if the grass dies, but chooses to stay because the money is too good. This is the beating heart of the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace. Because the sword of Batu has pacified the entire region from the Danube to the Altai Mountains, the trade routes are opened. A Venetian merchant can buy furs in Novgorod, float them down the Volga, sell them in Sarai for Chinese silk, and be back in Italy in time for carnival, all without paying a single bribe to a robber baron. The Horde is not just a vampire on the neck of Russia. It is the vascular system of the medieval economy. At the centre of it all sits the Altan Order, the golden tent of Batu. It is a structure of immense size, capable of holding hundreds of courtiers. Its wooden frame is covered in white felt, overlaid with panels of silk embroidered with gold thread, and topped with a golden finial that catches the light for miles. Inside, the atmosphere is a twilight of luxury. The floor is covered in layers of Persian carpet so thick they swallow the sound of footsteps. Batu sits on a throne of ivory and gold, raised above the rest. He is no longer the mud-spattered general of the invasion. He is a monarch in heavy silk robes, surrounded by the liquid court of kumis drinkers. But do not mistake this luxury for softness. Batu is the kingmaker. While the rest of the Mongol Empire in the east descends into succession crises and family feuds, Batu watches from the Volga with a cold, detached power. He is the elder statesman, the one whose support determines who sits on the throne of the great Khan in Karakoram. He has created a state within a state, autonomous and terrifyingly stable. He has learned the lesson of his grandfather. Conquest is easy, control is hard. To maintain this control, he employs a bureaucracy that is surprisingly sophisticated. Uyghur scribes sit to his left, recording tax receipts in a vertical script that looks like falling rain. Muslim merchants sit to his right, advising on exchange rates and harvest yields. The social fabric of the horde is also shifting. As the camera pans through the crowds of Sarai, you notice fewer and fewer pure Mongols with the distinct features of the eastern steppe. The Mongols were always a minority, a drop of oil in a bucket of water. Over time they are mixing with the local Turkic peoples, the Kipchaks. They are adopting the Turkic language, the local dress, and eventually the local religion, Islam, though that full conversion is still a few decades away. For now, the horde is a spiritual salad. Shamanists bang drums to drive away evil spirits next to Nestorian Christians singing hymns, while Franciscan monks wander through trying to convert everyone and usually just ending up confused. A distinctive feature of this society is the high status of women. You see noble Mongol women riding through the camp not in litters but on horseback, their faces uncovered. They wear the bogtak, a towering conical headdress made of birch bark and covered in silk, sometimes rising 2 or 3 feet above their heads, decorated with peacock feathers and pearls. These women are not secluded in harems. They own property, they advise their husbands, and when the men are away at war, they rule the camp. A foreign ambassador once noted with shock that the Khatun, the queen, sat next to the Khan at feasts, drinking from the same cup, her opinions sought on matters of state. It was a gender equality that would have given a European bishop a heart attack. But for the Russian princes, Sarai is not a place of wonder. It is a place of humiliation and survival. We see a delegation from the north arriving, led by a prince seeking his yarlik, the patent of authority. Before they can even see the Khan, they must endure the purification by fire. 2 great fires are lit, and the prince must walk between them to burn away any evil intent or poisons. It is a pagan ritual that terrifies the Orthodox Christians, but they do it because the alternative is death. They enter the golden tent, crawling on their knees, and knock their foreheads against the floor. They present their tribute, furs, silver, and slaves. Batu looks down at them, his face unreadable. He grants the yarlik, effectively making the prince his tax collector. This dynamic creates a strange psychological scar on the Russian soul, a duality of subservience and tyranny. The princes learn that power comes not from the people, but from the arbitrary favour of a distant, absolute ruler. Yet, in a twist of irony, the horde also protects them. The Teutonic Knights and the Lithuanians think twice about attacking a Russian city that flies the banner of the Khan. The golden yoke is heavy, but it is also a suit of armour. As the sun sets over the Volga, turning the river into a ribbon of molten copper, the sounds of the city change. The clang of the smiths fades, replaced by the melancholy drone of a Moran corps, the horsehead fiddle. The music mimics the sound of a stallion neighing and the wind blowing over the grass, a song of longing for the open steppe, even here in the city. Batu Khan steps out of his golden tent and looks west toward the land he conquered and then left. He looks east toward the homeland he will never see again. He is a man of the middle, the anchor of a bridge between worlds. The Golden Horde has become a fixture of the geopolitical landscape, a superpower that will dominate the history of Eastern Europe for 2.5 centuries. The force of nature has been bottled, domesticated, and turned into an empire of commerce and tribute. The violence of the invasion has receded into memory, replaced by the dull, heavy pressure of the tax collector and the efficient silence of the trade route. The wolf has settled down by the fire, but his eyes are still open and his teeth are still sharp. And far to the south, another wolf is waking up, one who cares little for trade or tents, but dreams only of the destruction of ancient cities. The story moves from the banks of the Volga to the banks of the Tigris, where the water is about to run black with ink and red with blood. The wind that blows across the Zagros Mountains is hot and dry, carrying the taste of ancient dust and the scent of bitter orange blossoms. We leave the cool, grassy banks of the Volga and the political machinations of the Golden Horde to follow the shadow of the Hawks south into the heart of the Middle East. It is the year 1258, and the sun is setting on the Islamic Golden Age. The camera of our mind descends upon the cradle of civilization, the land between the two rivers, where the Abbasid Caliphate has ruled for 5 centuries. This is Baghdad, the city of peace, a circular jewel of a metropolis where the streets are paved with tar to keep down the dust, and the air is filled with the murmur of poets, the scratching of quills, and the splashing of fountains. It is a city that believes itself eternal, protected by the prayers of the faithful and the sheer weight of its own history. But history, as we have seen, is light as a feather when the wind of the steppe begins to blow. The man riding toward this jewel is Hulagu Khan, the brother of the great Khan Monkey, and another grandson of Genghis. Hulagu is a different breed of conqueror. He is a man of grim determination, a shamanist with a Nestorian Christian wife, Dox Khatun, who travels with a portable church tent. He has been given a mandate by his brother: tear down the castles of the assassins, destroy the caliphate, and push the borders of the empire to Egypt. He is not here to trade, he is here to erase. Before he reaches Baghdad, Hulagu must deal with the Old Man of the Mountain and his order of assassins, the Nizaris, who have terrorized the Middle East for generations from their eagle nest fortresses in the Elburz Mountains. These were the men who killed kings and sultans with a whisper of a blade, believing themselves untouchable in their high-altitude strongholds like Alamut. They looked down at the world and sneered, but Hulagu does not play by the rules of conventional warfare. He does not fear the knife in the dark. He brings the mountain down. In 1256, the Mongol engineers, treating the impregnable cliffs like a geometry problem, construct winch-driven siege engines that haul massive stones up the sheer slopes. They bombard the castles until the walls shatter. The Grand Master of the Assassins surrenders, hoping for mercy. He finds none. The order that terrified the world is dismantled in a matter of months, their libraries burned, their influence extinguished. It is the appetizer before the main course. The road to Baghdad is now open. Inside the round city, the Caliph al-Mustasim sits on the throne of the Prophet. He is a man of profound spiritual authority and equally profound political incompetence. When his advisors warn him of the Mongol approach, suggesting he hire mercenaries or strengthen the walls, he waves them away. He is the commander of the faithful. Surely the entire Muslim world will rise to defend him. He sends a message to Hulagu, a mix of arrogance and bluff. Do not try to attack Baghdad. If you do, the sun will not rise, the rain will not fall, and the earth will shake. Hulagu, who has heard similar threats from the Jin Emperor, the Khwarezmian Sultan, and the Russian princes, is unimpressed. He turns to his generals and essentially says, "I guess we'll see about the weather." The Mongol army, swelling with auxiliaries from Armenia, Georgia, and even troops sent by his cousins in the Golden Horde, closes the ring. They arrive in January 1258. The Caliph, finally realizing that the sun is rising just fine and the Mongols are still there, sends out a small army. They are lured into the marshes, the dikes are breached, and they are drowned or cut down. The trap is sprung. The siege of Baghdad is a masterclass in psychological and physical destruction. The Mongols surround the city with a palisade and a ditch, sealing it off from the world. They set up their catapults, cutting down the ancient palm groves to build the engines of war. The bombardment begins. The House of Wisdom, the greatest library in the world, shakes with the impact of the stones. Inside the city, panic replaces arrogance. The Caliph sends envoys to negotiate, offering tribute. Hulagu refuses. The time for talk was yesterday. On February 10th, the city surrenders. The Caliph walks out of the gates, hoping to save his life. Hulagu forces him to watch as the city is sacked, and here the history becomes a sensory nightmare. The Mongols, unleashed after weeks of siege, pour into the city. The violence is methodical and absolute. The mosques are looted, the palaces stripped of their gold and tapestries. But the true tragedy, the wound that still aches in the cultural memory of the world, is the destruction of knowledge. Baghdad was the repository of the translations of Aristotle, the mathematics of India, the medical texts of Galen, and the poetry of Persia. It was the brain of the world. The Mongols, who valued practical knowledge, but had little patience for the theoretical musings of a city that had defied them, turned their fury on the libraries. The legend says that they threw the books into the Tigris River. So many manuscripts were discarded that the waters ran black with ink for days. River of ink. It is a haunting image. The collective wisdom of centuries dissolving into the muddy water, drifting downstream to the sea, lost forever. Historians still argue about the scale of this bibliographic holocaust. Some suggest that Nasir al-Din al-Tusi, a Persian scholar in Hulagu's service, managed to save thousands of manuscripts by spiriting them away to an observatory in Marageh before the looting began. We must hope this is true, that a candle was kept burning in the dark. But the loss was undeniably catastrophic. It was a lobotomy of Islamic civilization. Then comes the fate of the Caliph himself. Hulagu is a superstitious man. The Mongol laws, the Yasa, forbid the spilling of royal blood on the ground, for fear that the sky spirits will be offended and bring bad luck. But the Caliph must die. He is the symbol of resistance. So, the Mongols devise a solution that respects the letter of the law while violating the spirit of humanity. They roll Al-Mustasim up in a magnificent carpet, perhaps one from his own treasury. Then, they ride their horses over the carpet. The Caliph is trampled to death, his blood soaked into the wool, never touching the earth. It is a grim, ceremonial end to the Abbasid line. Before this, there is a famous, perhaps apocryphal story that adds a layer of dark, ironic humour to the tragedy. It is said that Hulagu locked the Caliph in his treasury, surrounded by piles of gold and silver, but gave him no food or water. When the Caliph begged for bread, Hulagu asked, "If you had so much gold, why did you not use it to pay your soldiers or reinforce your walls? You cannot eat gold." It is the ultimate critique of hoarding wealth over survival. The smell of the decaying city becomes so overpowering that Hulagu has to move his camp upwind. The city of peace is a ruin. The canals that irrigated the fertile lands of Mesopotamia are destroyed or neglected, leading to the salinization of the soil, an ecological disaster that some historians argue did more long-term damage to the region than the sword. The agricultural base of Iraq collapses, and the centre of Islamic power shifts permanently to Cairo, to the Mamluks, the only force left standing. As the smoke of Baghdad drifts away, blending with the black waters of the Tigris, a silence falls over the east. The force of nature has accomplished its mission. The head has been cut off. Hulagu looks further west, toward Syria, toward the Mediterranean. He feels invincible. He has crushed the assassins. He has crushed the caliph. Who is left to stop him? He does not know that in the deserts of Egypt, a one-eyed warrior named Baibars is sharpening his sword, and that the history we began with, the clash at Ain Jalut, is rushing toward him like a freight train. But for now, the sun sets on a river of ink, and the ghosts of scholars weep on the banks, mourning the books that will never be read again. The wind that once blew in a single terrifying direction, pushing the banners of the nine-tailed yak endlessly outward, now begins to swirl in a confused, violent vortex. We stand in the year 1262, on the frozen banks of the Terek River in the Caucasus Mountains, a jagged scar of ice separating the lands of the Golden Horde from the lands of the Ilkhanate. The air here is cold enough to freeze breath in the throat, but the heat of anger burning between the cousins who face each other across the ice is enough to melt a glacier. The story has reached its tragic, inevitable pivot point. The bundle of arrows that Genghis Khan had held up to his sons on his deathbed, the lesson that unity is strength and separation is death, has finally snapped. The Mongol Empire, the largest contiguous land empire in human history, is about to commit suicide. The force of nature has turned inward, and the wolf has begun to eat its own tail. The catalyst for this fracture was the death of the great Khan Mongke in 1259, another roll of the dice by the universe that saved the rest of the world but doomed the Mongols to civil war. When the throne became empty, two brothers reached for it. Kublai, the sophisticated, Sinicized intellectual in China, and Arik Burka, the traditionalist guarding the homeland in Mongolia. But while they wrestled for the crown in the east, a far more personal and bitter feud was erupting in the west, one that would redefine the geopolitical map of the Middle East. It was a war between cousins, between Batu's brother Berk, the ruler of the Golden Horde, and Hulagu, the conqueror of Baghdad. And at the heart of this war was not just land, but God. Berka Khan was a man of the steppe, but his soul had turned toward Mecca. He was the first Mongol prince to convert to Islam, a conversion that historians still argue was either a genuine spiritual awakening or a calculated political move to align himself with the powerful Turkic merchants of his realm. Regardless of the motive, his faith was real enough that when news reached him of what Hulagu had done to Baghdad, the trampling of the caliph, the river of ink, the slaughter of the faithful, Berka trembled with rage. He is reported to have said he has sacked all the cities of the Muslims and has brought about the death of the caliph. With the help of God, I will call him to account for so much innocent blood. It was a stunning declaration. For the first time, a Mongol prince was prioritizing his religion over his bloodline. The Yasa of Genghis Khan, which demanded absolute loyalty to the family above all else, was being rewritten by the Quran. The tension was exacerbated by a dispute over the spoils of war. The Caucasus region, modern-day Azerbaijan, was a lush, grassy highway, perfect for horses, and both the Golden Horde and the Ilkhanate claimed it. It was the classic fight between brothers over the best room in the house, but played out with armies of 100,000 men. In the winter of 1262, the Cold War turned hot. Hulagu, fresh from his defeat at Ain Jalut, where Berka had tacitly supported the Mamluks, cheering for the enemy of his cousin, marched north. He pushed the Golden Horde forces back across the Terek River, capturing their camp. It seemed at night like another easy victory for the conqueror of Baghdad, but Hulagu had forgotten the lesson of the Mongol winter. He was fighting the Golden Horde on their home turf, the ice. The Battle of the Terek River is a scene of cinematic horror. As Hulagu's army celebrated in the captured camp, Burka's general, Nogai, launched a surprise counterattack. The Ilkhanate forces, caught off guard, were driven back onto the frozen river. The ice, weakened by the thundering of thousands of hooves and the sudden shifting of weight, began to groan. It is a sound that must have haunted the survivors for the rest of their lives, the deep cracking boom of a frozen river giving way. In an instant, the white battlefield turned into a black churning grave. Thousands of Hulagu's finest warriors, men who had survived the deserts of Syria and the mountains of Persia, were swallowed by the freezing water. They drowned in their heavy armour, pulled down by the weight of their own invincibility. Hulagu watched from the bank, helpless, as his army vanished. He retreated south, broken, and died shortly after. Some say of a broken heart, others say of the sheer stress of fighting his own kin. Meanwhile, in the east, the Toluid civil war between Kublai and Arik Burka was grinding to a halt. Kublai, controlling the agricultural wealth of China, had simply starved his brother out. He cut off the supply lines to Karakoram, the city of felt, the capital that Ogadai had built, with its silver tree and wine fountains, withered. The traditional Mongols of the steppe, who despised the soft life of the cities, found that they could not eat grass and tradition alone. Arik Burka surrendered in 1264. Kublai spared his life, but kept him under house arrest, a sad caged end for the champion of the old ways. Kublai declared himself the Great Khan, but the title rang hollow. The unity was gone. The Khan in China could no longer command the Khan in Persia or the Khan in Russia. The riders of the Yam postal system now had to carry passports and worry about border crossings. The world empire had fractured into 4 distinct Khanates: the Golden Horde in Russia, the Ilkhanate in the Middle East, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, and the Yuan dynasty in China. This fracturing marked the end of the existential threat to the rest of the world. The force of nature was no longer a single storm. It was 4 separate weather systems, often blowing against each other. The Europeans, the Mamluks, and the Japanese, who would soon face Kublai's failed invasions, could breathe a sigh of relief. The Mongols were too busy fighting each other to conquer the rest of the planet. But for the Mongols themselves, it was a tragedy of Shakespearean proportions. They had conquered the world only to lose themselves. The Pax Mongolica continued, but it was an armed peace, a peace of guarded borders and suspicious cousins. As the camera pulls back from the cracking ice of the Terek River, we see the map of Asia changing colours. The uniform blue of the Mongol Empire is breaking into a mosaic. The Golden Horde settles deeper into the Russian steppe, becoming more Turkic, more Muslim, turning its eyes toward trade with Egypt and Genoa. The Ilkhanate in Persia begins to rebuild the cities it destroyed, its rulers eventually becoming patrons of the very Islamic arts their grandfathers had burned. The Chagatai Khanate remains a wild traditionalist middle ground, a keeper of the old flame. And in the east, Kublai Khan turns his back on the steppe entirely. He looks at the ruins of the Jin and the Song, and he decides that he does not want to be a Khan of the felt tent. He wants to be an emperor of the silk throne. He moves his capital from the windy plains of Karakoram to the side of the old Jin capital Zhongdu and renames it Dadu, Great Capital, modern Beijing. The city of felt is abandoned to the wind and the sand, a ghost town of imperial ambition. The focus shifts to the court of Kublai, where a new dream is being built, not of infinite war, but of infinite wealth. The sword is sheathed and the silk is unfurled. The force of nature is about to put on a tuxedo. The wind that once screamed across the frozen tundra has been tamed, softened, and perfumed with the scent of jasmine, sandalwood, and stagnation. We have travelled far from the muddy banks of the Volga and the shattered ices of the Terek, arriving now in the humid, gilded embrace of the East. It is the late 13th century, and the camera of our mind drifts over a landscape that feels less like history and more like a fever dream painted on silk. This is the domain of Kublai Khan, the grandson who traded the felt tent for the stately pleasure dome. We find ourselves first not in the great capital, but in the summer retreat of Xanadu, or Shangdu as the Mongols called it. It sits on the edge of the steppe, a transition point between the wild grass and the sown field, an architectural metaphor for Kublai himself. Here, the force of nature has decided to take a vacation. The palace is a marvel of contradictions, a huge enclosure of masonry, inside of which sits a movable palace made of cane and bamboo, gilt and varnished so heavily that it shines like a mirror in the sun. It is a tent that has forgotten how to travel, held down by silk cords, a nomad's dream frozen in amber. It is here that Samuel Taylor Coleridge, centuries later, would envision Alf, the sacred river, running through caverns measureless to man, fueled by an opium-induced haze that was perhaps not so different from the reality of the court itself. At the centre of this dreamscape sits Kublai Khan. He is no longer the lean, hungry wolf of the steppe. He is a man of immense girth, suffering from gout, a painful swelling of the joints caused by a diet rich in organ meats and alcohol, the occupational hazard of being a Mongol ruler with infinite resources. He does not ride a horse into battle. He is carried in a lavish palanquin mounted on the backs of 4 elephants, a sight that would have made Genghis Khan spit in disgust. Yet, do not mistake his physical softness for weakness of will. Kublai has achieved what his grandfather never could, the total conquest of China. He has crushed the Song dynasty, the last bastion of Han Chinese power. The war was long and brutal, culminating in the siege of the twin cities of Xiangyang and Fancheng, a 6-year stalemate that was only broken when Kublai imported Persian engineers from his nephew in the Ilkhanate to build massive counterweight trebuchets, the Muslim mangonels that smashed the walls to dust. In 1279, at the naval battle of Yamen, the last Song loyalists, seeing that all was lost, grabbed the child emperor and leaped off a cliff into the sea, ending a dynasty and cementing Kublai as the first non-Han ruler of all China. He is the Shizu, the founder of the Yuan dynasty. He has claimed the mandate of heaven, arguing that the eternal blue sky has chosen him to unite the world. To rule this vast, complex land, Kublai builds a new capital, Dadu, the great capital which rests on the foundations of modern Beijing. It is a city of perfect geometry, a chessboard of power designed to awe the visitor into submission. The streets are so straight and wide that a horseman can see from one gate to the other, a feature that satisfies the Mongol love of open sightlines. In the centre is the Forbidden City, not the one tourists see today, which is a Ming creation, but its Yuan ancestor, a fortress of privacy where the Khan lives surrounded by a court of mind-boggling scale. We see the Hall of Great Virtue, where the Khan holds court. The floors are gold and silver. On the dais, Kublai sits on a raised couch, his empress Chabi next to him. The court etiquette is terrifyingly strict. Everyone must take off their shoes before entering. If you step on the threshold, a sacred boundary in Mongol culture, you are beaten or executed. A quiet, deadly order prevails. Into this world steps a figure who will become our eyes and ears, a young Venetian merchant named Marco Polo. He arrives in 1275, wide-eyed, and perhaps a little prone to exaggeration, accompanied by his father and uncle, To Kublai, these Europeans are curiosities, pets from the edge of the map. He likes Marco. The boy has a knack for storytelling and observation. While the Chinese bureaucrats recite dry statistics about tax yields, Marco tells the Khan about the strange customs of his own people, about the spiders of the south, about the black stones, coal, that burn like wood. Marco becomes a favourite, a keshig of sorts, sent on diplomatic missions to the far corners of the empire. Through Marco's eyes, or at least through the book he later dictated in a Genoese prison, we see the wonders of Yuan China. He describes the flying money, the paper currency made from the bark of mulberry trees. To a European used to clinking gold coins, the idea that a piece of paper stamped with red ink has value is pure alchemy, a state-enforced magic trick. He describes the postal stations where runners wear bells to announce their arrival, a system so efficient that fresh lychees can be delivered from the tropical south to the Khan's table in the north before they spoil. However, we must pause for a note of scholarly intrigue. For centuries, historians have argued whether Marco Polo actually went to China at all. Skeptics point out that he never mentions tea, he never mentions the Great Wall, though it was mostly earthen ruins then, and most damningly, he never mentions foot binding, the painful practice that was common among upper-class Chinese women. They suggest he might have just made it to a Persian trading post and picked up stories from other travellers, creating a bestseller of lies. But modern consensus leans toward the truth of his journey. His descriptions of the salt production, the layout of the cities, and the specific names of local officials are too accurate to be second-hand. The omissions are likely due to his specific position. He was a foreigner living in the Mongol bubble, interacting mostly with other foreigners, the Semu caste, and Mongols, drinking kumis instead of tea, and rarely seeing the private quarters of Chinese women. He was a tourist in a gilded cage, seeing exactly what the Khan wanted him to see, and what a cage it was. The court of Kublai is a liquid court. In a new sense, it is awash in alcohol and spectacle. The Khan hosts banquets for 40,000 people. He has mechanical peacocks that flap their wings and pour wine. He keeps a stable of 10,000 snow-white horses, whose milk is reserved only for the imperial family. He employs a team of weather shamans whose sole job is to ensure that rain does not fall on the royal palace when the Khan is outdoors, a primitive form of weather control that Marco Polo swears actually worked. But beneath the gold leaf, the rot is setting in. The Mongols are becoming too Chinese for the steppe and too Mongol for the Chinese. They've created a rigid caste system, Mongols at the top, Semu, Central Asians, Persians, second, Northern Chinese third, and the Southern barbarians, the Song Chinese, at the bottom. This apartheid breeds deep resentment. The scholar officials, the Confucian elite who have run China for centuries, are sidelined, forced to work as clerks for illiterate Mongol overseers. They write poetry about their sorrow, comparing the Khan's rule to a dust storm that obscures the sun. Kublai himself is a tragic figure in his later years. His beloved wife Chabi dies, removing the one voice of moderation in his life. His designated heir dies. He eats and drinks to numb the pain, becoming obese and secluded. He launches disastrous naval invasions of Japan, the kamikaze, or divine wind typhoons smashing his fleets, not once but twice, and expensive, failed campaigns into the jungles of Vietnam and Java. The force of nature is bogging down in the mud. The treasury is empty, drained by war, and the lavish gifts given to the princes to keep them loyal. The paper money begins to suffer from inflation. The magic trick is failing. The dreams of Xanadu are turning into a hangover. Yet, to the outside world, the Yuan dynasty is the peak of civilization. It is a time when a man can buy a book in Hangzhou, printed with movable type, pay for it with paper money, and read it by the light of a coal fire, technologies that Europe will not see for centuries. The Pax Mongolica has connected the Pacific to the Black Sea, but the connection is thinning. As Kublai closes his heavy eyelids in the Hall of Great Virtue, dreaming of the open steppe he can no longer ride, the foundation of his pleasure dome is already cracking. The wind is shifting again, blowing not from the grasslands, but from the angry streets of the conquered, carrying the scent of rebellion. But for now, the music plays on. The wine flows from the mechanical peacock, and the Khan sleeps, the master of a world that is slowly slipping through his fingers like grains of golden sand. The wind that blows across the Eurasian landmass now carries a sound that has never been heard before in human history, not the scream of the dying or the thunder of hooves, but the steady, rhythmic jingle of camel bells, a sound that stretches unbroken from the Pacific Ocean to the Black Sea. We have entered the era of the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace, a period of about a century where the force of nature stopped breaking things and started connecting them. The camera of our mind pulls back to see the Silk Road not as a single dusty track, but as a glowing nervous system, a web of arteries pulsing with life. It is the first time the world is truly globalized. A man can buy a sack of peppercorns in India, trade it for a bolt of Chinese silk in Tabriz, sell that for a Russian fur in Sarai, and end up with a bag of Venetian silver coins, all without ever leaving the shadow of the Mongol administration. The tangled, painful chapter of petty wars and robber barons has been smoothed out by the iron hand of the Khan. The road is open. The borders are gone. The world has shrunk. At the heart of this miracle is the Yam, the Mongol postal system, which we have glimpsed before, but now see in its full glory. It is the spine of the empire. Every 25 or 30 miles, like beads on a string, stands a station. Inside there are fresh horses, warm food and beds. But these are not just for the mailmen. They are the infrastructure of commerce. A merchant with the right paperwork can travel with a speed and safety that was previously unimaginable. And speaking of paperwork, let us look at the ultimate status symbol of the 13th century, the paisa. It is a tablet of gold, silver or wood, worn around the neck or tied to the belt. To the illiterate bandit or the stubborn gatekeeper, it is a magic talisman. It bears the image of the gyr-falcon and the words of the Khan, "By the power of eternal heaven, let an edict of the emperor be respected. He who disobeys shall die." A traveller holding a golden paisa is not just a man. He is the Khan himself in effigy. He can demand horses, food and protection anywhere in the empire. It is a diplomatic passport, a credit card and a loaded gun all rolled into one. Historians tell the story of the Polos travelling with such a tablet, watching as hardened warriors bowed their heads and cleared the road for 3 merchants, simply because they carried the medal of the Khan. The safety of this road gave rise to a famous historical saying, one that captures the mythos of the era perfectly. A maiden bearing a nugget of gold on her head could wander from the land of the rising sun to the land of the setting sun without suffering the slightest molestation. While we might smile at the image and suspect that the maiden might have been safe mostly because anyone who touched her would have been flayed alive by the local patrol, the underlying truth is undeniable. The Mongols had a zero-tolerance policy for banditry. They understood that trade was the milk that fed the empire. If the road was unsafe, the tax revenue stopped. So they hunted bandits with the same ferocity they hunted enemy armies. They made the local communities responsible for the safety of the road. If a merchant was robbed in your district, the village paid for the loss. Unsurprisingly, the villagers became very enthusiastic neighbourhood watchmen. But the Silk Road carried more than just gold and silk. It carried ideas. It was a superhighway of the mind. In the markets of Tabriz and Samarkand we see a collision of cultures that created sparks of brilliance. Consider the famous blue and white porcelain of China. It is the quintessential Chinese art form, right? Wrong. It is a child of the Mongol piece. The cobalt pigment needed to create that deep, vibrant blue is not found in China. It comes from Persia. Before the Mongols, the trade was too difficult. But under the Yuan and the Ilkhanate, Persian cobalt flowed east to Chinese kilns, and Chinese ceramic techniques flowed west to Persian potters. The result was a hybrid masterpiece that would eventually grace the tables of European kings. We see medical knowledge moving too. Muslim doctors brought their knowledge of surgery and pharmacology to China, while Chinese doctors brought the secrets of pulse diagnosis and acupuncture to the Middle East. It was a cross-fertilization of genius. We see food changing. The dumpling, the mantu, travels west to become the Turkish manti and the Korean mandu. The world is literally eating from the same pot. The travellers on this road are as diverse as the goods. We have met Marco Polo, but let us look at his mirror image, Rabban Bar Sauma. He is a Nestorian Christian monk born in Beijing. Yes, a Chinese Christian who decides to go on a pilgrimage to Jerusalem. He travels west, carrying the Paisa of the Ilkhan, and ends up going all the way to Europe. He meets the King of France, he meets the Pope, he visits the University of Paris. Imagine the scene. A man from China, speaking Turkish and Persian, celebrating Mass in a cathedral in Bordeaux, discussing theology with cardinals who can barely comprehend where he comes from. He is the reverse Marco Polo, a testament to the fact that the East was often more curious about the West than the other way around. He writes a travelogue that describes Europe as a quaint, somewhat backward place, full of strange religious quarrels, a perspective that flips the standard historical narrative on its head. However, we must also acknowledge the shadow that walks beside the maiden with the gold. The Silk Road was also a highway of human misery. The Mongols were the greatest slave traders of the age. The Pax was built on the backs of the defeated. We see columns of captives, Russian artisans, Hungarian silversmiths, Persian weavers, being marched thousands of miles to serve in the workshops of Karakorum and Dardu. They are the human fuel of the empire. The Genoese merchants waiting at the terminus of the road in the Crimea, in the port city of Kaffa, grew rich buying these slaves, Circassians, Tatars, Russians, and shipping them to Egypt to become Mamluks, or to Italy to serve as housemaids. The economy of the Mediterranean was inextricably linked to the conquests of the steppe. The gold the maiden carried was often the price of a human life. And there is another traveller on the road, one that carries no paisa and pays no tax. It is a stowaway, hiding in the saddlebags of the grain carts, in the fur of the marmots, in the guts of the fleas. The very speed of the yam system, the very efficiency that allows a letter to cross the continent in weeks, is about to become the empire's undoing. In the past, a disease outbreak in a remote village in Yunnan or the steppes of Central Asia would have burned itself out in isolation. The distance was a quarantine, but now the quarantine is broken. The world is connected. The bacteria, Yersinia pestis, has found a superhighway. It is moving west, hopping from rodent to flea to human, riding the same carts that carry the silk and the spices. The Pax Mongolica has unwittingly built the delivery system for the apocalypse. The maiden with the gold is walking towards a cliff, and she doesn't even know it. The air in the caravanserais is thick with the smoke of hookahs and the smell of roasting meat, and the merchants count their profits, unaware that the ledger is about to be wiped clean. The world connected is about to share a common grave. The camera lingers on a marmot popping its head out of a burrow near a trade route in the foothills of the Himalayas, twitching its nose at the passing caravan, a tiny furry harbinger of the end of the world. The wind that once filled the sails of commerce and the lungs of conquerors now carries a scent that makes the very air feel heavy and bruised, the sickly sweet metallic smell of death. We have arrived in the mid-14th century, the twilight of the Mongol moment, where the force of nature is about to meet a force far older and far more lethal than itself. The camera of our mind focuses on the smallest of things, a flea riding on the back of a black rat, which is scurrying into a grain cart in a caravanserai somewhere near Lake Issyk-Kul in Central Asia. The cart belongs to a merchant protected by the Paisa of the Khan, travelling the safe, efficient roads of the Pax Mongolica. He is heading west towards the Crimea, towards Europe. He thinks he is carrying silk and wax. He does not know he is carrying the end of the world. The bacterium Yersinia pestis, the invisible arrow, has awakened from its slumber in the burrowing rodent populations of the steppe. In the past, the vast distances of the grasslands acted as a firebreak, keeping outbreaks isolated, but the Mongols have removed the firebreaks. They have built a bridge of continuous contact from the Pacific to the Mediterranean. The efficiency of the Yam system, the pride of the empire, now becomes its executioner. The disease moves with the speed of a galloping horse, jumping from station to station, turning the arteries of trade into veins of poison. The horror begins not in Europe, as our textbooks often focus, but in the heart of the Mongol domains. The Ilkhanate in Persia and the Golden Horde in Russia are the first to feel the chill. In the bustling cities of the Golden Horde, the river of ink becomes a river of silence. We see the great capital of Sarai, the city of tents and brick, turning into a ghost town. The markets are empty. The smiths have stopped hammering. The only sound is the creaking of carts carrying bodies to mass graves on the edge of the steppe. The tax revenue, the lifeblood of the Khan's power, simply evaporates. You cannot tax the dead, and the living are too busy dying to shear sheep or harvest wheat. The golden tent is still there, but the men who sit inside it are trembling. They are warriors who can shoot a bird on the wing from 300 yards, who can endure hunger and cold, but they cannot fight this. There is no enemy to stab. There is no wall to breach. The enemy is in the air, in the water, in the touch of a loved one. The force of nature is being dismantled by nature itself. The crisis reaches its cinematic apogee in the year 1346 at the siege of Kaffa. The Golden Horde, led by Khan Janibeg, is besieging the Genoese trading port on the Crimean coast. It is a clash over trade rights and slave markets, a standard medieval dispute. But this siege is different. The Mongol army is not being defeated by the Genoese defenders, it is dissolving. The plague has struck the camp. Janibeg watches from his royal pavilion as thousands of his soldiers fall ill every day, swelling with the telltale buboes, delirious with fever, dying in agony. The siege lines are collapsing. The army is rotting. In a final act of frustration, vengeance, and perhaps a twisted strategic logic, Janibeg orders his engineers to load the catapults, not with stones, but with the corpses of the plague victims. It is a scene of grotesque horror that has etched itself into history as the first recorded instance of biological warfare. The bodies hurtle over the walls of Kaffa, landing in the streets, splashing the pestilence onto the defenders. Scholars still debate the medical efficacy of this tactic. Modern epidemiology suggests that the plague requires the flea vector to spread effectively, and dead bodies cool down too fast for fleas to stay on them. Fleas prefer a warm host. It is more likely that the rats from the Mongol camp simply scurried into the city through the drainage pipes or open gates. But the image of the flying dead remains the potent symbol of the era, the moment the Mongols physically threw the Black Death into Europe. The Genoese, terrified by the rain of bodies and the sudden outbreak within their walls, flee to their ships. They set sail for Italy, for Sicily, for home. They think they are escaping. In reality, they are the spores of the fungus. When these death ships dock in Messina and Genoa, they unload their cargo of spices and rats, and the great mortality begins its harvest of Europe, killing perhaps a third to half of the population. The Mongol connection has delivered its final terrible export. But let us look back at the East. The plague does not just kill people, it kills the empire. In China, the Yuan dynasty is already tottering under the weight of corruption and inflation. Then the plague hits. It is followed by massive floods of the Yellow River, the river of sorrow. The mandate of heaven is clearly being withdrawn. The peasantry, starving and dying, rise up. They are led not by generals, but by mystics and monks. The Red Turban Rebellion explodes across the countryside. The Mongol cavalry, once invincible, is now underfunded, undermanned, and terrified. They are swept away not by a superior military tactic, but by a tidal wave of desperate humanity. In 1368, the last Yuan emperor, Togon Temur, flees Dardu. He retreats back to the Mongolian steppe, back to the felt tents, back to the silence. The great capital falls. The dynasty is over. In Persia, the Ilkhanate has already disintegrated. The last effective Ilkhan, Abu Sa'id, died in 1335, possibly of the plague, or perhaps poisoned, leaving no heir. The realm fractured into a tangled, painful chapter of petty warlords and squabbling mini-states, a mirror of the chaos that existed before Genghis arrived. The Pax Mongolica is dead. The Silk Road, once a highway of safety, is now a broken chain. The caravanserai are abandoned to the scorpions. The bandits return. The borders go back up. The world, which had been briefly held together by the iron will of the Khans, snaps back into isolation. The global village of the 13th century becomes the walled gardens of the 14th. The tragedy of the Mongols is that their greatest achievement, connectivity, became their undoing. They built a world that was too interconnected for its own immune system. As the pandemic burns itself out, it leaves behind a changed landscape. The demographic collapse weakens the Golden Horde, forcing them to rely even more on the Russian princes to collect taxes, unknowingly strengthening the very hand that will eventually strangle them. In the West, the labour shortage caused by the plague empowers the peasantry, helping to end feudalism. The invisible arrow has reshaped the world more thoroughly than a million Mongol arrows ever could. As the camera pulls back from the silent port of Kaffa, watching the Genoese sails disappear over the horizon, we feel a sense of profound melancholy. The energy of the expansion is gone. The adrenaline of the conquest has faded into the lethargy of sickness. The force of nature is exhausted. The storm has blown itself out. All that remains is the long, slow retreat of the tide, leaving the wreckage of empires on the beach. The story is drawing to a close, not with a bang, but with a cough in the dark. The descendants of Genghis Khan are retreating into the twilight of the steppe, and the world they made is turning its back on them. The wind that has howled for a century and a half, tearing at the roots of mountains and whipping the seas into foam, finally begins to lose its breath. We have reached the year 1480, and the world has grown old and tired of war. The camera of our mind drifts to the banks of the Ugra River, a quiet, winding waterway about 150 miles southwest of Moscow. It is late autumn, the time when the Russian sky turns the colour of a bruised plum, and the frost begins to knit the surface of the water into lace. On the northern bank stands the army of Ivan III, the Grand Prince of Moscow, a man with a beard like a shovel and eyes that have seen the future. He is no longer a vassal, he is the gatherer of the Russian lands. Years earlier, in a moment of symbolic defiance that has been painted and dramatized 1,000 times, he reportedly took the Yarlik, the Khan's patent, spat on it, and tore it to pieces. He stopped paying the tribute. He stopped bowing the knee. He challenged the ghost of the golden yoke to manifest itself or vanish forever. On the southern bank stands Akhmat Khan, The leader of the Great Horde, the rump state that remains of the glorious Golden Horde, Akhmet is the old wolf trying to summon the terrifying magic of his ancestors. He has marched north to punish the insolent Russian, to burn Moscow as Batu did, to remind the world that the Mongols are still the masters of the earth. But as he looks across the water, he does not see a collection of frightened princes. He sees a unified wall of muskets, cannons, and heavy infantry. The force of nature is facing a wall of stone. The great stand on the Ugra is one of the most anticlimactic and yet profound moments in military history. It is a battle that never happens. For weeks, the two armies stare at each other across the river. There are skirmishes, arrows flying across the water, the occasional attempt to ford the shallows. But the Russians hold the line. Their firearms, a new technology that the Mongols have been slow to adopt in mass, spit fire and lead, turning the river crossings into death traps. The Mongols are baffled. Their entire way of war depends on manoeuvre, on the feigned retreat, on the open plain. Here, stuck in the mud and the forests facing a static defensive line, they are paralysed. It is a collision of eras. The fluid, nomadic warfare of the 13th century smashing uselessly against the gunpowder's entrenched statecraft of the early modern period. The invisible arrow of time has rendered the Mongol bow obsolete. As the days turn into weeks, the general winter arrives early. The river begins to freeze. In the past, this would have been the Mongol moment. The ice was their highway. But Akhmet Khan hesitates. His horses are starving. The fodder has been eaten. His allies, the Lithuanians, have failed to show up, and far to his rear, his capital of Sarai is being raided by the Crimean Tatars, a rival Mongol faction that is allied with Moscow. The bundle of arrows is not just broken, the arrows are shooting each other. On November 11th, 1480, without a major battle, without a final cataclysmic charge, Akhmet Khan turns his horse around. He orders the retreat. The force of nature simply walks away. There is no thunder, only the crunch of snow under hoof as the great horde fades back into the steppe. The Russians watch them go, scarcely believing their eyes. They wait for the trick, for the feigned retreat, but the horizon remains empty. The yoke is broken. It didn't end with a bang, but with a long, cold silence on a frozen river. Akhmet Khan would be killed shortly after by his own rivals, and the great horde would dissolve into smaller bickering khanates, Kazan, Astrakhan, Crimea. They would remain a nuisance, raiding for slaves and causing trouble for centuries. But the existential threat, the scourge of God that threatened to swallow the world, was gone. The Mongol Empire did not vanish, it evaporated. It became part of the genetic and cultural soil of Eurasia. In India, a descendant of Timur and Genghis, Babur, would found the Mughal Empire, building the Taj Mahal and ruling in splendour until the British came. In China, the UN administrative divisions became the provinces of the Ming and Qing. In Russia, the Muscovite state adopted the Mongol postal system, the census, and the autocratic style of rule, transforming the Khan's authority into the Tsar's. The force of nature had been absorbed by the very civilizations it tried to destroy. The camera pulls back now, rising higher and higher until the armies on the Ugra are just specks of dust, until the Great Wall is a thin line, until the trade routes are faint veins on the skin of the earth. We see the curve of the planet spinning slowly in the dark. The screams of the sack of Baghdad are gone. The thunder of the hooves at Legnica is gone. The silence of the steppe returns, claiming back the cities of felt and the palaces of wood. The grass grows over the ruins of Karakoram. The wind blows over the secret grave of Genghis Khan, keeping its watch over the man who tried to own the horizon. The 150 years of the Golden Horde were a storm that cleared the air, a fire that burned the forest so new growth could emerge. It connected the world, it broke the world, and then it left the world to heal. The Mongol moment was a flash of lightning in the long night of history, terrifying, illuminating, and fleeting. And as the darkness returns, we realize that the storm has passed. The air is still, the night is quiet. The history belongs to the ghosts now. Now, let the camera of your mind dissolve into the soft velvet darkness of the present moment. The great armies have marched away, their banners folded into the mist. The kings and khans, the warriors and the poets have all laid down their burdens, returning to the earth that cradles us all. Feel the silence of the steppe settling over you, not as a cold wind, but as a heavy, warm blanket of peace. The force of nature is asleep. The only sound is the gentle rhythm of your own breathing, steady and slow, like the rocking of a boat on a calm river. The fires of the past have burned down to glowing embers, casting a soft orange light that flickers and fades, flickers and fades. You are safe here, far from the thunder of hooves, far from the shifting maps. There is no more history to be written tonight, only the blank, comforting page of sleep. Let your thoughts drift like the smoke from a dying campfire, rising up into the eternal blue sky, dispersing into the stars. The world is vast, but you are warm. The journey is over. The horizon is closing its eyes. Sweet dreams